Mary Clay looked out of the window of the old farmhouse. The view was dreary enough, hill and field and woodland, bare, colorless, mist covered, with no other house in sight. She had never been a woman to crave for company. She liked sewing, she was passionately fond of reading, she was not fond of talking. Probably she could have been very happy at Crum Farm, alone. Before her marriage she had looked forward to the long evenings with her sewing and reading. She knew that she would be busy enough in the day, for the farmhouse was old and rambling, and she was to have no help in the housework. But she looked forward to quiet, peaceful, lamp-lit evenings, and only lately, after 10 years of married life, had she reluctantly given up the hope of them. For peace was far enough from the old farm kitchen in the evening. It was driven away by John Clay's loud voice, raised always in orders or complaints, or in the stumbling, incoherent reading aloud of his newspaper. Mary was a silent woman herself, and a lover of silence. But John liked to hear the sound of his voice. He liked to shout at her, to call for her from one room to another. Above all, he liked to hear his voice reading the paper out loud to her in the evening. She dreaded that most of all. It had lately seemed to jar on her nerves till she felt she must scream aloud. His voice going on, raucous and sing-song, became unspeakably irritating. His "Mary!" summoning her from her household work to wherever he happened to be, his "Get my slippers," or "Bring me my pipe," exasperated her almost to the point of rebellion. "Get your own slippers" had trembled on her lips, but had never passed them, for she was a woman who could not bear anger. Noise of any kind appalled her. She had borne it for 10 years, so surely she could go on with it. Yet today, as she gazed hopelessly at the wintry countryside, she became acutely conscious that she could not go on with it. Something must happen. Yet what was there that could happen? It was Christmas next week. She smiled ironically at the thought. Then she noticed the figure of her husband coming up the road. He came in at the gate and round to the side door. "Mary!" She went slowly in answer to the summons. He held a letter in his hand. "Met the postman," he said. "From your aunt." She opened the letter and read it in silence. Both of them knew quite well what it contained. "She wants us to go over for Christmas again," said Mary. He began to grumble. "She's as deaf as a post. She's most as deaf as her mother was. She ought to know better than to ask folks over when she can't hear a word any one says." Mary said nothing. He always grumbled about the invitation at first, but really he wanted to go. He liked to talk with her uncle. He liked the change of going down to the village for a few days and hearing all its gossip. He could quite well leave the farm to the "hands" for that time. The Crewe deafness was proverbial. Mary's great-grandmother had gone stone deaf at the age of 35. Her daughter had inherited the affliction, and her granddaughter, the aunt with whom Mary had spent her childhood, had inherited it also at exactly the same age. "All right," he said at last, grudgingly, as though in answer to her silence. "We'd better go. Write and say we'll go." It was Christmas Eve. They were in the kitchen of her uncle's farmhouse. The deaf old woman sat in her chair by the fire knitting. Upon her sunken face there was a curious sardonic smile that was her habitual expression. The two men stood in the doorway. Mary sat at the table looking aimlessly out of the window. Outside, the snow fell in blinding showers. Inside, the fire gleamed on to the copper pots and pans, the crockery on the old oak dresser, the hams hanging from the ceiling. Suddenly James turned. "Jane!" he said. The deaf woman never stirred. "Jane!" Still there was no response upon the enigmatic old face by the fireside. "Jane!" She turned slightly towards the voice. "Get them photos from upstairs to show John," he bawled. "What about boats?" she said. "Photos!" roared her husband. "Coats?" she quavered. Mary looked from one to the other. The man made a gesture of irritation and went from the room. He came back with a pile of picture postcards in his hand. "It's quicker to do a thing one's self," he grumbled. "They're what my brother sent from Switzerland, where he's working now. It's a fine land, to judge from the views of it." John took them from his hand. "She gets worse?" he said, nodding toward the old woman. She was sitting gazing at the fire, her lips curved into the curious smile. Her husband shrugged his shoulders. "Ay, she's nigh as bad as her mother was." "And her grandmother." "Ay, it takes longer to tell her to do something than to do it myself. And deaf folks get a bit stupid, too. Can't see what you mean. They're best let alone." The other man nodded and lit his pipe. Then James opened the door. "The snow's stopped," he said. "Shall we go to the end of the village and back?" The other nodded and took his cap from behind the door. A gust of cold air filled the room as they went out. Mary took a paper-backed book from the table and came over to the fireplace. "Mary!" She started. It was not the sharp, querulous voice of the deaf old woman. It was more like the voice of the young aunt whom Mary remembered in childhood. The old woman was leaning forward, looking at her intently. "Mary, a happy Christmas to 'ee!" And, as if in spite of herself, Mary answered in her ordinary low tones, "The same to you, auntie." "Thank'ee, thank'ee." Mary gasped. "Aunt, can you hear me speaking like this?" The old woman laughed silently, rocked to and fro in her chair as if with pent-up merriment of years. "Oh, yes, I can hear 'ee, child. I've always heard 'ee." Mary clasped her hand eagerly. "Then you're cured, aunt?" "Ay, I'm cured as far as there was ever anything to be cured." "You—" "I was never deaf, child, nor never will be, please God. I've took you all in fine." Mary stood up in bewilderment. "You never deaf?" The old woman chuckled again. "No, nor my mother, nor her mother neither." Mary shrank back from her. "I don't know what you mean," she said unsteadily. "Have you been pretending?" "I'll make you a Christmas present of it, dearie," said the old woman. "My mother made me a Christmas present of it when I was your age, and her mother made her one. I haven't a lass of my own to give it to, so I give it to you. It can come on quite sudden like, if you want it, and then you can hear what you choose and not hear what you choose. Do you see?" She leant nearer and whispered, "You're shut out of it all, of having to fetch and carry for 'em, answer their daft questions, and run their errands like a dog. I've watched you, my lass. You don't get much peace, do you?" Mary was trembling. "Oh, I don't know what to think," she said. "I couldn't do it." "Do what you like," said the old woman. "Take it as a present, anyways. The Crewe deafness for a Christmas present." She chuckled. "Use it or not, as you like. You'll find it main amusin', anyways." And into the old face there came again that curious smile, as if she carried in her heart some jest fit for the gods on Olympus. The door opened suddenly with another gust of cold air, and the two men came in again, covered with fine snow. "I'll not do it," whispered Mary, trembling. "We didn't get far. It's coming on again," remarked John, hanging up his cap. The old woman rose and began to lay the supper, silently and deftly, moving from cupboard to table without looking up. Mary sat by the fire, motionless and speechless, her eyes fixed on the glowing coals. "Any signs o' the deafness in her?" whispered James, looking towards Mary. "It come on my wife just when she was that age." "Ay, so I've heerd." Then he said loudly, "Mary!" A faint pink colour came into her cheeks, but she did not show by look or movement that she had heard. James looked significantly at her husband. The old woman stood still for a minute with a cup in each hand, and smiled her slow, subtle smile.
The custom of Christmas trees came from Germany. I can remember when they were first introduced into England, and what wonderful things we thought them. Now every village school has its tree, and the scholars openly discuss whether the presents have been good or mean as compared with other trees in former years. The first one that I ever saw I believe to have come from good Father Christmas himself, but little boys have grown too wise now to be taken in for their own amusement. They are not excited by secret and mysterious preparations in the back drawing-room. They hardly confess to the thrill, which I feel to this day, when the folding doors are thrown open, and amid the blaze of tapers, Mamma, like a fate, advances with her scissors to give every one what falls to his lot. Well, young people, when I was 8 years old, I had not seen a Christmas tree, and the first picture of one I ever saw was the picture of that held by old Father Christmas in my godmother's picture book. "What are those things on the tree?" I asked. "Candles," said my father. "No, father, not the candles, the other things." "Those are toys, my son." "Are they ever taken off?" "Yes, they are taken off and given to the children who stand around the tree." Patty and I grasped each other by the hand, and with one voice murmured, "How kind of old Father Christmas!" By and by I asked, "How old is Father Christmas?" My father laughed and said, 1,830 years, child, which was then the year of our Lord, and thus 1,830 years since the first great Christmas day. "He looks very old," whispered Patty. And I, who was for my age what Kitty called Bible learned, said thoughtfully, and with some puzzledness of mind, "Then he's older than Methuselah." But my father had left the room, and did not hear my difficulty. November and December went by, and still the picture book kept all its charm for Patty and me, and we pondered on and loved old Father Christmas as children can love and realize a fancy friend. To those who remember the fancies of their childhood, I need say no more. Christmas week came. Christmas Eve came. My father and mother were mysteriously and unaccountably busy in the parlor. We had only one parlor, and Patty and I were not allowed to go in. We went into the kitchen, but even here was no place of rest for us. Kitty was all over the place, as she phrased it, and cakes, mince pies, and puddings were with her. As she justly observed, there was no place there for children and books to sit with their toes in the fire, when a body wanted to be at the oven all along. The cat was enough for her temper, she added. As to Puss, who obstinately refused to take a hint, which drove her out into the Christmas frost, she returned again and again with soft steps and a stupidity that was, I think, affected to the warm hearth, only to fly at intervals like a football before Kitty's hasty slipper. We had more sense, or less courage. We bowed to Kitty's behests and went to the back door. Patty and I were hardy children, and accustomed to run out in all weathers without much extra wrapping up. We put Kitty's shawl over our two heads and went outside. I rather hoped to see something of Dick, for it was holiday time, but no Dick passed. He was busy helping his father to bore holes in the carved seats of the church, which were to hold sprigs of holly for the morrow. That was the idea of church decoration in my young days. You have improved on your elders there, young people, and I am candid enough to allow it. Still, the sprigs of red and green were better than nothing, and, like your lovely wreaths and pious devices, they made one feel as if the old black wood were bursting into life and leaf again for very Christmas joy, and, if only one knelt carefully, they did not scratch his nose. Well, Dick was busy and not to be seen. We ran across a little yard and looked over the wall at the end to see if we could see anything or anybody. From this point there was a pleasant meadow field sloping prettily away to a little hill about 3/4 of a mile distant, which, catching some fine breezes from the moors beyond, was held to be a place of cure for whooping cough, or kincough as it was vulgarly called. Up to the top of this Kitty had dragged me and carried Patty when we were recovering from the complaint, as I well remember. It was the only change of air we could afford, and I dare say it did as well as if we had gone into badly drained lodgings at the seaside. This hill was now covered with snow, and stood off against the grey sky. The white fields looked vast and dreary in the dusk. The only gay thing to be seen were the berries on the holly hedge in the little lane, which, running by the end of our backyard, led up to the hall, and the fat robin that was staring at me. I was looking at the robin when Patty, who had been peering out of her corner of Kitty's shawl, gave a great jump that dragged the shawl from our heads, and cried, "Look!" I looked. An old man was coming along the lane. His hair and beard were as white as cotton wool. He had a face like the sort of apple that keeps well in winter. His coat was old and brown. There was snow about him in patches, and he carried a small fir tree. The same conviction seized upon us both. With one breath we exclaimed, "It's old Father Christmas!" I know now that it was only an old man of the place, with whom we did not happen to be acquainted, and that he was taking a little fir tree up to the hall to be made into a Christmas tree. He was a very good-humoured old fellow, and rather deaf, for which he made up by smiling and nodding his head a good deal, and saying "Aye, aye, to be sure," at likely intervals. As he passed us and met our earnest gaze, he smiled and nodded so earnestly that I was bold enough to cry, "Good evening, Father Christmas." "Same to you," said he in a high-pitched voice. "Then you are Father Christmas," said Patty. "And a Happy New Year," was Father Christmas's reply, which rather put me out. But he smiled in such a satisfactory manner that Patty went on, "You're very old, aren't you?" "So I be, miss, so I be," said Father Christmas, nodding. "Father says you're 1830 years old," I muttered. "Aye, aye, to be sure," said Father Christmas. "I'm a long age." "A very long age," thought I, and I added, "You're nearly twice as old as Methuselah, you know," thinking that this might have struck him. "Aye, aye," said Father Christmas, but he did not seem to think anything of it. After a pause he held up the tree and cried, "Do you know what this is, little miss?" "A Christmas tree?" said Patty, and the old man smiled and nodded. I leaned over the wall and shouted, "But there are no candles." "By and by," said Father Christmas, nodding as before. "When it's dark they'll all be lighted up. That'll be a fine sight." "Toys, too, there'll be, won't there?" said Patty. Father Christmas nodded his head. "And sweeties," he added expressively. I could feel Patty trembling, and my own heart beat fast. The thought which agitated us both was this: was Father Christmas bringing the tree to us? But very anxiety, and some modesty also, kept us from asking outright. Only when the old man shouldered his tree and prepared to move on, I cried in despair, "Oh, are you going?" "I'm coming back by and by," said he. "How soon?" cried Patty. "About 4 o'clock," said the old man, smiling. "I'm only going up yonder." Up yonder? This puzzled us. Father Christmas had pointed, but so indefinitely that he might have been pointing to the sky, or the fields, or the little wood at the end of the squire's grounds. I thought the latter, and suggested to Patty that perhaps he had some place underground like Aladdin's cave, where he got the candles and all the pretty things for the tree. This idea pleased us both, and we amused ourselves by wondering what old Father Christmas would choose for us from his stores in the wonderful hole where he dressed his Christmas trees. "I wonder, Patty," said I, "why there's no picture of Father Christmas's dog in the book." For at the old man's heels in the lane there crept a little brown and white spaniel, looking very dirty in the snow. "Perhaps it's a new dog that he's got to take care of his cave," said Patty. When we went indoors we examined the picture afresh by the dim light from the passage window, but there was no dog there. My father passed us at this moment and patted my head. "Father," said I, I don't know, but I do think Old Father Christmas is going to bring us a Christmas tree tonight." "Who's been telling you that?" said my father. But he passed on before I could explain that we had seen Father Christmas himself, and had had his word for it that he would return at 4 o'clock, and that the candles on his tree would be lighted as soon as it was dark. We hovered on the outskirts of the rooms till 4 o'clock came. We sat on the stairs and watched the big clock, which I was just learning to read, and Patty made herself giddy with constantly looking up and counting the 4 strokes, toward which the hour hand slowly moved. We put our noses into the kitchen now and then, to smell the cakes and get warm, and anon we hung about the parlour door, and were most unjustly accused of trying to peep. What did we care what our mother was doing in the parlour, we who had seen Father Christmas himself, and were expecting him back again every moment? At last the church clock struck. The sounds boomed heavily through the frost, and Patty thought there were 4 of them. Then, after due choking and worrying, our own clock struck, and we counted the strokes quite clearly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we got Kitty's shawl once more, and stole out into the back yard. We ran to our old place and peeped, but could see nothing. "We'd better get up on to the wall," I said, and with some difficulty and distress, from rubbing her bare knees against the cold stone and getting the snow up her sleeves, Patty got on to the coping of the little wall. I was just struggling after her, when something warm and something cold coming suddenly against the bare calves of my legs made me shriek with fright. I came down with a run and bruised my knees, my elbows, and my chin, and the snow that hadn't gone up Patty's sleeves went down my neck. Then I found that the cold thing was a dog's nose, and the warm thing was his tongue, and Patty cried from her post of observation, "It's Father Christmas's dog, and he's licking your legs." It really was the dirty little brown and white spaniel, and he persisted in licking me, and jumping on me, and making curious little noises, that must have meant something if one had known his language. I was rather harassed at the moment. My legs were sore, I was a little afraid of the dog, and Patty was very much afraid of sitting on the wall without me. "You won't fall," I said to her. "Get down, will you?" I said to the dog. "Humpty Dumpty fell off a wall," said Patty. "Bow wow," said the dog. I pulled Patty down, and the dog tried to pull me down, but when my little sister was on her feet, to my relief, he transferred his attentions to her. When he had jumped at her and licked her several times, he turned around and ran away. "He's gone," said I. "I'm so glad." But even as I spoke, he was back again, crouching at Patty's feet and glaring at her with eyes the color of his ears. Now, Patty was very fond of animals, and when the dog looked at her, she looked at the dog, and then she said to me, "He wants us to go with him." On which, as if he understood our language, though we were ignorant of his, the spaniel sprang away, and went off as hard as he could, and Patty and I went after him, a dim hope crossing my mind. Perhaps Father Christmas had sent him for us. The idea was rather favoured by the fact he led us up the lane, only a little way, then he stopped by something lying in the ditch, and once more we cried in the same breath, "It's old Father Christmas!" Returning from the hall, the old man had slipped upon a bit of ice, and lay stunned in the snow. Patty began to cry. "I think he's dead," she sobbed. "He is so very old, I don't wonder," I murmured, "but perhaps he's not. I'll fetch father." My father and Kitty were soon on the spot. Kitty was as strong as a man, and they carried Father Christmas between them into the kitchen. There he quickly revived. I must do Kitty the justice to say that she did not utter a word of complaint at the disturbance of her labours, and that she drew the old man's chair close up to the oven with her own hand. She was so much affected by the behaviour of his dog that she admitted him even to the hearth, on which Puss, being acute enough to see how matters stood, lay down with her back so close to the spaniel's that Kitty could not expel one without kicking both. For our parts, we felt sadly anxious about the tree. Otherwise, we could have wished for no better treat than to sit at Kitty's round table, taking tea with Father Christmas. Our usual fare of thick bread and treacle was to-night exchanged for a delicious variety of cakes, which were none the worse to us for being tasters and wasters, that is, little bits of dough or shortbread put in to try the state of the oven, and certain cakes that had got broken or burnt in the baking. Well, there we sat, helping Old Father Christmas to tea and cake, and wondering in our hearts what could have become of the tree. Patty and I felt a delicacy in asking Old Father Christmas about the tree. It was not until we had had tea 3 times round, with tasters and wasters to match, that Patty said very gently, "It's quite dark now," and then she heaved a deep sigh. Burning anxiety overcame me. I leaned toward Father Christmas and shouted. I had found out that it was needless to shout. "I suppose the candles are on the tree now?" "Just about putting of 'em on," said Father Christmas. "And the presents, too?" said Patty. "Aye, aye, to be sure," said Father Christmas, and he smiled delightfully. I was thinking what further questions I might venture upon, when he pushed his cup toward Patty, saying, "Since you are so pressing, miss, I'll take another dish." And Kitty, swooping on us from the oven, cried, "Make yourself at home, sir. There's more where these came from. Make a long arm, Miss Patty, and hand them cakes." So we had to devote ourselves to the duties of the table, and Patty, holding the lid with one hand and pouring with the other, supplied Father Christmas's wants with a heavy heart. At last he was satisfied. I said grace, during which he stood, and indeed he stood for some time afterward with his eyes shut. I fancy under the impression that I was still speaking. He had just said a fervent Amen, and reseated himself, when my father put his head into the kitchen and made this remarkable statement: "Old Father Christmas has sent a tree to the young people." Patty and I uttered a cry of delight, and we forthwith danced round the old man, saying, "How nice! Oh, how kind of you!" which I think must have bewildered him, but he only smiled and nodded. "Come along," said my father. "Come, children. Come, Reuben. Come, Kitty." And he went into the parlour, and we all followed him. My godmother's picture of a Christmas tree was very pretty, and the flames of the candles were so naturally done in red and yellow that I always wondered that they did not shine at night. But the picture was nothing to the reality. We had been sitting almost in the dark, for, as Kitty said, firelight was quite enough to burn at meal times, and when the parlour door was thrown open, and the tree with lighted tapers on all the branches burst upon our view, the blaze was dazzling, and threw such a glory round the little gifts, and the bags of coloured muslin with acid drops and pink rose drops and comfits inside, as I shall never forget. We all got something, and Patty and I, at any rate, believed that the things came from the stores of Old Father Christmas. We were not undeceived even by his gratefully accepting a bundle of old clothes which had been hastily put together to form his present. We were all very happy, even Kitty, I think, though she kept her sleeves rolled up, and seemed rather to grudge enjoying herself, a weak point in some energetic characters. She went back to her oven before the lights were out and the angel on the top of the tree taken down. She locked up her present, a little work-box, at once. She often showed it off afterward, but it was kept in the same bit of tissue paper till she died. Our present certainly did not last so long. The old man died about a week afterward, so we never made his acquaintance as a common personage. When he was buried, his little dog came to us. I suppose he remembered the hospitality he had received. Patty adopted him, and he was very faithful. Puss always looked on him with favour. I hoped during our rambles together in the following summer that he would lead us at last to the cave where Christmas trees are dressed, but he never did. Our parents often spoke of his late master as old Reuben, but children are not easily disabused of a favourite fancy, and in Patty's thoughts and in mine the old man was long gratefully remembered as Old Father Christmas.
This is an editorial that appeared in The Sun. We take pleasure in answering at once and thus prominently the communication below, expressing at the same time our great gratification that its faithful author is numbered among the friends of The Sun.
Dear Editor, I am 8 years old. Some of my little friends say there is no Santa Claus. Papa says if you see it in the Sun, it's so. Please tell me the truth. Is there a Santa Claus? Virginia O. Hanlon, 115 West 95th Street.
Virginia, your little friends are wrong. They have been affected by the skepticism of a skeptical age. They do not believe except they see. They think that nothing can be which is not comprehensible by their little minds. All minds, Virginia, whether they be men's or children's, are little. In this great universe of ours, man is a mere insect, an ant in his intellect, as compared with the boundless world about him, as measured by the intelligence capable of grasping the whole of truth and knowledge. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. He exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist, and you know that they abound and give to your life its highest beauty and joy. Alas, how dreary would be the world if there were no Santa Claus! It would be as dreary as if there were no Virginias. There would be no childlike faith then, no poetry, no romance to make tolerable this existence. We should have no enjoyment, except in sense and sight. The eternal light with which childhood fills the world would be extinguished. Not believe in Santa Claus! You might as well not believe in fairies. You might get your papa to hire men to watch in all the chimneys on Christmas Eve to catch Santa Claus. But even if they did not see Santa Claus coming down, what would that prove? Nobody sees Santa Claus. But that is no sign that there is no Santa Claus. The most real things in the world are those that neither children nor men can see. Did you ever see fairies dancing on the lawn? Of course not, but that's no proof that they are not there. Nobody can conceive or imagine all the wonders there are unseen and unseeable in the world. You may tear apart the baby's rattle and see what makes the noise inside, but there is a veil covering the unseen world which not the strongest man, nor even the united strength of all the strongest men that ever lived, could tear apart. Only faith, fancy, poetry, love, romance can push aside that curtain and view and picture the supernal beauty and glory beyond. Is it all real? Ah, Virginia, in all this world there is nothing else real and abiding. No Santa Claus! Thank God he lives, and he lives forever. 1,000 years from now, Virginia, nay, 10 times 10,000 years from now, he will continue to make glad the heart of childhood.
It was an ideal Christmas day. The sun shone brightly, but the air was crisp and cold, and snow and ice lay sparkling everywhere. A light wind the night before had swept the blue ice-bound river clean of scattering snow, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon the broad bend near Creighton's mill was fairly alive with skaters. The girls in gay caps and scarves, the boys in sweaters and mackinaws of every conceivable hue, with here and there a plump matronly figure in a plush coat, or a tiny fellow in scarlet, made a picture of life and brilliancy worthy of an artist's finest skill. Tom Reynolds moved in and out among the happy throng, with swift, easy strokes, his cap on the back of his curly head, and his brown eyes shining with excitement. Now and again he glanced down with pardonable pride at the brand-new skates that twinkled beneath his feet. Jolly ramblers, sure enough jolly ramblers they were. Ever since Ralph Evans had remarked, with a tantalizing toss of his handsome head, that no game fellow would try to skate on anything but jolly ramblers, Tom had yearned with an inexpressible longing for a pair of these wonderful skates. And now they were his, and the ice was fine, and the Christmas sun was shining. Tom was rounding the big bend for the 50th time, when he saw, skimming gracefully toward him through the merry crowd, a tall boy in a fur-trimmed coat, his handsome head proudly erect. "That's Ralph Evans now," said Tom to himself. "Just wait till you see these skates, old boy, and maybe you won't feel so smart." And with slow, cautious strokes he made his way through laughing boys and girls to a place just in front of the tall skater coming toward him down the broad white way. When Ralph was almost upon him, Tom paused and, in conspicuous silence, looked down at his shining skates. "Hello," said Ralph good-naturedly, seizing Tom's arm and swinging around. Then, taking in the situation with a careless glance, he added, "Get a new pair of skates for Christmas?" "Jolly Ramblers," said Tom impressively. "The best Jolly Ramblers on the market." Ralph was a full half-head the taller, but as Tom delivered himself of this speech with his head held high, he felt every inch as tall as the boy before him. If Ralph was deeply impressed, he failed to show it, as he answered carelessly, "Huh, that's so. Pretty good little skates they are, the Jolly Ramblers." "You said no game fellow would use any other make," said Tom hotly. "Oh, bet that was nearly a year ago," said Ralph. "I got a new pair of skates for Christmas, too," he added, as if it had just occurred to him. "Clubhouse skates, something new in the market just this season. Just look at the curve of that skate, will you?" he added, lifting a foot for inspection. "And that clamp that you couldn't shake off if you had to. They're guaranteed for a year, too, and if anything gives out, you get a new pair for nothing. $3.50 they cost at Mr. Harrison's hardware store. I gave my Jolly Ramblers to a kid about your size. A mighty good little skate they are." And with a long, graceful stroke, Ralph Evans skated away. And it seemed to Tom Reynolds that all his Christmas joy went skimming away behind him. The sun still shone, the ice still gleamed, the skaters laughed and sang, but Tom moved slowly on with listless, heavy strokes. The Jolly Ramblers still twinkled beneath his feet, but he looked down at them no more. What was the use of Jolly Ramblers when Ralph Evans had a pair of clubhouse skates that cost $1 more, had a graceful curve and a faultless clamp, and were guaranteed for a year? It was only 4 o'clock when Tom slipped his new skates carelessly over his shoulder and started up the bank for home. He was slouching down the main street, head down, hands thrust deep into his pockets, when, on turning a corner, he ran plump into a full moon. Now I know it is rather unusual for full moons to be walking about the streets by daylight, but that is the only adequate description of the round freckled face that beamed at Tom from behind a great box held by 2 sturdy arms. "That came pretty near being a collision," said the owner of the full moon, still beaming, as he set down the box and leaned against a building to rest a moment. "Nobody hurt, I guess," said Tom. "Been down to the ice?" asked the boy eagerly. "I could see the skaters from Patton's store. Oh, I see you got some new skates for Christmas. Ain't they beauties now?" And he beamed on the despised Jolly Ramblers with his heart in his little blue eyes. "A pretty good little pair of skates," said Tom, in Ralph's condescending tone. "Good! Well, I should guess yes! And Christmas ice just made a purpose." In spite of his ill humor, Tom could not help responding to the warm interest of the shabby boy at his side. He knew him to be Harvey McGinnis, the son of a poor Irish widow, who worked at Patton's department store out of school hours. Looking at the great box with an awakening interest, he remarked kindly, "What you been doing with yourself on Christmas Day?" "Want to know, sure enough?" said Harvey mysteriously, his round face beaming more brightly than ever. "Well, I've been doing the Santy Claus act down at Patton's store. About a week ago," he went on, leaning back easily against the tall building and thrusting his hands down deep into his well-worn pockets. "About a week ago, As I was cleaning out the storeroom, I came on 3 big boxes with broken dolls in 'em. Beauties they were, I can tell you. The Lady Jane in a blue silk dress, the Lady Clarabelle in pink, and the Lady Matilda in shimmerin' white. Nothin' wrong with 'em either, only broken rubbers that put their j'ints out o' whack and set their heads a-rollin' this way and that. They could be fixed in no time, I says to myself, and what a prize they'd be for the kids, to be sure. For Mom and me had racked our brains considerable how we'd scrape together the money for Christmas things for the girls. So I went to the boss and I asked him right out what he'd charge me for the 3 ladies just as they was. And he says, "Jimmy," he says, I've told him me name a dozen times, but he allus calls me Jimmy. "Jimmy," he says, "if you'll come down on Christmas Day and help me take down the fixin's and fix up the store for regular trade, I'll give you the dolls for nothin'," he says. So I explained to the kids that Santy'd be late to our house this year, with so many to see after it wouldn't be strange, and went down to the store early this morning and finished me work and fixed up the ladies as good as new. Would you like to be seein' 'em now?" he added, turning to the great box with a look of pride. "Sure, I'd like to see 'em," said Tom. With careful, almost reverent touch, Harvey untied the string and opened the large box, disclosing 3 smaller boxes, one above the other. Opening the first box, he revealed a really handsome doll in a blue silk dress, with large dark eyes that opened and shut, and dark curling locks of real hair. "This is the Lady Jane," he said, smoothing her gay frock with gentle fingers. "We're going to give her to Kitty. Kitty's hair is pretty and curly, but she hates it 'cause it's red, and she thinks black hair is the prettiest kind in the world. Ain't it funny how all of us will be wantin' what we don't have ourselves?" Tom did not reply to this bit of philosophy, but he laid a repentant hand on the Jolly Ramblers as if he knew he had wronged them in his heart. "That's as handsome a doll as ever I saw, and no mistake," he said. Pleased with this praise, Harvey opened the second box and disclosed the Lady Matilda, with fair golden curls and a dress of shimmerin' white. "The Lady Matilda goes to Josephine," said Harvey. "Josephine has black hair straight as a string, and won't she laugh, though, to see them fetchin' yellow curls?" "She surely ought to be glad," said Tom. The Lady Clarabelle was another fair-haired lady in a gown of the brightest pink. "This here beauty's for the baby," said Harvey, his eyes glowing. "She don't care if the hair's black or yellow, but won't that stunnin' dress make her eyes pop out?" "They'll surely believe in Santy when they see those beauties," said Tom. "That's just what I was sayin' to Mom this morning," said Harvey. "Kitty's had some doubts. She's almost 9. But when she sees those fine ladies, she'll be dead sure Mom and I didn't buy 'em. If I had a Santa Claus suit, I'd dress up and hand 'em out myself." Tom's face lighted with a bright idea. "My brother Bob's got a Santa Claus suit that he used in a show last Christmas," he said. "Say, let me dress up and play Santa for you. The girls would never guess who I was." "Wouldn't they stare, though?" said Harvey delightedly. "But do you think you'd want to take time?" he asked apologetically. "And you with a new pair of skates and the ice like this?" "Of course I want to if you'll let me," said Tom. "I'll skate down the river and meet you anywhere you say." "Out in our backyard, then, at 7 o'clock," said Harvey. "All right, I'll be there." And with head up and skates clinking, Tom hurried away. It was a flushed, excited boy who burst into the Reynolds' quiet sitting room a few minutes later, with his skates still hanging on his shoulder and his cap in his hand. "Say, Mother," he cried, "can I have Bob's Santa Claus suit this evening, please? I'm going to play Santa Claus for Harvey McGinnis." "Play Santa Claus for Harvey McGinnis? What do you mean, child? You know Mrs. McGinnis, Mother, that poor woman who lives in the little house by the river. Her husband got killed on the railroad last winter, you know. Well, Harvey, her boy, has fixed up some grand-looking dolls for his sisters, and he wants me to come out and play Santa tonight." And Tom launched out into a long story about Harvey and his good fortune. "He must be a splendid boy," said Mrs. Reynolds heartily, "and I am sure I shall be glad to have you go." "And another thing, Mother," said Tom, hesitating a little. "Do you think Grandma would care if I spent part of that $5 she gave me for a pair of skates for Harvey? He hasn't any skates at all, and I know he'd just love to have some." "It is generous of you to think of it," said his mother, much pleased. "And you would still have 2.5 for that little trip down to Grandma's." "But I'd like to get him some clubhouse skates," said Tom. "They're a new kind that cost $3.50. "But I thought you said the Jolly Ramblers were the best skates made." Mrs. Reynolds looked somewhat hurt as she glanced from Tom to the skates on his shoulder and back to Tom again. "They are, Mother, they're just dandies," said Tom, blushing with shame that he could ever have despised his mother's gift. "But these clubhouse skates are just the kind for Harvey. You see, Harvey's shoes are old and worn, and these clubhouse skates have clamps that you can't shake loose if you have to. Then if anything happens to them before the year's up, you get a new pair free, and Harvey, you know, wouldn't have any money to be fixing skates." "Well, do as you like," said Mrs. Reynolds, pleased with Tom's eagerness, for such a spell of generosity was something new in her selfish younger son. "But remember, you will have to wait a while for your visit to Grandma." "All right, and thank you, Mother," said Tom. "You can buy the skates down at Harrison's, and I'm going over and ask Mr. Harrison if he won't open up the store and get a pair for me for a special time like this. I'm most sure he will." And away he flew. That evening at 7, as the moon was rising over the eastern hills, a short, portly Santa Claus stepped out of the dry reeds by the river bank and walked with wonderfully nimble feet right into the McGinnis's little backyard. As he neared the small back porch, a dark figure rose to greet him, one hand held up in warning, the other holding at arm's length a bulky grain sack full to the brim. "Here's your pack, Sandy," he whispered gleefully. "They're all waitin' in the front room yonder. I'll slip in the back way whilst you go around and give a good thump at the front door, and Mom'll let you in." Trembling with eagerness, Tom tiptoed round the house, managing to slip an oblong package into the capacious depths of the big sack as he did so. Thump! Thump! How his knock re-echoed in the frosty air! The door swung wide, and Mrs. McGinnis's gaunt figure stood before him. "Good evening, Santy. Come right in," she said. Tom had always thought what a homely woman Harvey's mother was when he happened to meet her at the grocery, with her thin red hair drawn severely back from her gaunt face, and a black shawl over her head. But as he looked up into her big, kind face so full of Christmas sunshine, he wondered he could ever have thought her anything but lovely. The room was small and bare, but wonderfully gay with pine and bits of red and green crepe paper, saved from the fixins at the store. And on a large bed in the corner sat the 3 little girls, Kitty with her bright curls bobbing, Josephine with her black braids sticking straight out, and the baby with tiny blue eyes that twinkled and shone like Harvey's. The fine speech that Tom had been saying over to himself for the past 2 hours seemed to vanish into thin air before this excited little audience. But in faltering, stammering tones which everyone was too excited to notice, he managed to say something about Merry Christmas and good children, and then proceeded to open the magic sack. "Miss Kitty McGinnis," he called in deep, gruff tones. Kitty took the box he offered with shy embarrassment, slowly drew back the lid, and gave a cry of amazement and delight. "A doll! Oh, the loveliest doll that ever was!" she cried. Then, turning to her brother, she whispered as softly as excitement would permit, "Oh, Harvey, I'm afeard you paid too much." "Aw, go on," said Harvey, his face more like a full moon than ever. "Don't you know that Santy can do whatever he wants to?" The other dolls were received with raptures, Josephine stroking the golden curls of the Lady Matilda with wondering fingers, and the baby dancing round and round, waving the pink-robed Lady Clarabelle above her head. "Mr. Harvey McGinnis," came the gruff tones of Santa Claus, and Harvey smiled over to his mother as he drew out a pair of stout cloth gloves. "Mrs. McGinnis," and that good lady smiled back as she shook out a dainty white apron with a coarse embroidery ruffle. "I reckon Sandy wanted you to wear that of a Sunday afternoon," said Harvey, awkwardly. "And I'll be proud to do it," said his mother. Little sacks of candy were next produced, and everyone settled down to enjoy it, thinking that the bottom of the big sack must be reached, when Santa called out in tones that trembled beneath the gruffness, "Another package for Mr. Harvey McGinnis." "For me? What?" said Harvey, taking the heavy oblong bundle. Then, as the sparkling clubhouse skates met his view, his face lit up with a glory that Tom never forgot. The glory lasted but a moment. Then he turned a troubled face toward the bulky old saint. "You never ought to have done it," he said. "These must have cost a lot." "Aw, go on," was the reply in a distinctly boyish tone. "Don't you know that Sandy can do whatever he wants to?" And, with a prodigious bow, old Santa was gone. A few minutes later, a slender boy with a bundle under his arm was skating swiftly down the shining river in the moonlight. As he rounded the bend, a tall figure in a fur-trimmed coat came skimming slowly toward him, and a voice called out in Ralph Evans' condescending tones, "Well, how are the Jolly Ramblers doing tonight?" But the answer this time was clear and glad and triumphant. "The best in the world," said Tom. "And isn't this the glorious night for skating?"
'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a lustre of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew at a moment it must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles his courses they came, and he whistled, and he shouted, and he called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Dunder and Blitzen. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. And as dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they met with an obstacle mount to the sky, so up to the housetops the courses they flew, with a sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. and then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes how they twinkled, his dimples how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed, like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
The little girl came into her papa's study, as she always did Saturday morning before breakfast, and asked for a story. He tried to beg off that morning, for he was very busy, but she would not let him. So he began. "Well, once there was a little pig." She put her hand over his mouth and stopped him at the word. She said she had heard little pig stories till she was perfectly sick of them. "Well, what kind of story shall I tell, then?" "About Christmas. It's getting to be the season. It's past Thanksgiving already." "It seems to me," her papa argued, "that I've told as often about Christmas as I have about little pigs." "No difference. Christmas is more interesting." "Well," her papa roused himself from his writing by a great effort. "Well, then, I'll tell you about the little girl that wanted it Christmas every day in the year. How would you like that?" "First rate," said the little girl, and she nestled into comfortable shape in his lap, ready for listening. "Very well, then. This little pig what were you pounding me for?" "Because you said little pig instead of little girl." "I should like to know what's the difference between a little pig and a little girl that wanted it Christmas every day." "Papa," said the little girl warningly, "if you don't go on, I'll give it to you." And at this her papa darted off like lightning, and began to tell the story as fast as he could. "Well, once there was a little girl who liked Christmas so much that she wanted it to be Christmas every day in the year. And as soon as Thanksgiving was over, she began to send postal cards to the old Christmas fairy to ask if she mightn't have it. But the old fairy never answered any of the postals, and after a while the little girl found out that the fairy was pretty particular, and wouldn't notice anything but letters, not even correspondence cards in envelopes, but real letters on sheets of paper, and sealed outside with a monogram, or your initial, anyway. So then she began to send her letters, and in about 3 weeks, or just the day before Christmas it was, she got a letter from the fairy saying she might have it Christmas every day for a year, and then they would see about having it longer. The little girl was a good deal excited already, preparing for the old-fashioned once-a-year Christmas that was coming the next day, and perhaps the fairy's promise didn't make such an impression on her as it would have made at some other time. She just resolved to keep it to herself, and surprise everybody with it as it kept coming true, and then it slipped out of her mind altogether. She had a splendid Christmas. She went to bed early, so as to let Santa Claus have a chance at the stockings, and in the morning she was up the first of anybody, and went and felt them, and found hers all lumpy with packages of candy and oranges and grapes and pocketbooks and rubber balls and all kinds of small presents, and her big brothers with nothing but the tongs in them, and her young lady sisters with a new silk umbrella, and her papas and mammas with potatoes and pieces of coal wrapped up in tissue paper, just as they always had every Christmas. Then she waited around till the rest of the family were up, and she was the first to burst into the library when the doors were opened, and look at the large presents laid out on the library table, books and portfolios and boxes of stationery and breastpins and dolls and little stoves and dozens of handkerchiefs and inkstands and skates and snow shovels and photograph frames and little easels and boxes of watercolors and Turkish paste and nougat and candied cherries and dolls' houses and waterproofs, and the big Christmas tree lighted and standing in a waste-basket in the middle. She had a splendid Christmas all day. She ate so much candy that she did not want any breakfast, and the whole forenoon the presents kept pouring in that the expressman had not had time to deliver the night before. And she went round giving the presents she had got for other people, and came home and ate turkey and cranberry for dinner, and plum pudding, and nuts, and raisins, and oranges, and more candy, and then went out and coasted, and came in with a stomach-ache, crying. And her papa said he would see if his house was turned into that sort of fool's paradise another year. And they had a light supper, and pretty early everybody went to bed cross. Here the little girl pounded her papa in the back again. "Well, what now? Did I say pigs?" "You made them act like pigs." "Well, didn't they?" "No matter. You oughtn't to put it into a story." "Very well, then. I'll take it all out." Her father went on. The little girl slept very heavily, and she slept very late, but she was awakened at last by the other children dancing round her bed with their stockings full of presents in their hands. "What is it?" said the little girl, and she rubbed her eyes and tried to rise up in bed. "Christmas! Christmas! Christmas!" they all shouted, and waved their stockings. "Nonsense! It was Christmas yesterday." Her brothers and sisters just laughed. "We don't know about that. It's Christmas to-day, anyway. You come into the library and see." Then all at once it flashed on the little girl that the fairy was keeping her promise, and her year of Christmases was beginning. She was dreadfully sleepy, but she sprang up like a lark that had overeaten itself and gone to bed cross, and darted into the library. There it was again, books and portfolios and boxes of stationery and breastpins. "You needn't go over it all, papa. I guess I can remember just what was there," said the little girl. Well, and there was the Christmas tree blazing away, and the family picking out their presents, but looking pretty sleepy, and her father perfectly puzzled, and her mother ready to cry. "I'm sure I don't see how I'm to dispose of all these things," said her mother, and her father said it seemed to him they had had something just like it the day before, but he supposed he must have dreamed it. This struck the little girl as the best kind of a joke, and so she ate so much candy she didn't want any breakfast, and went round carrying presents, and had turkey and cranberry for dinner, and then went out and coasted, and came in with a Papa! Well, what now? What did you promise, you forgetful thing? Oh, yes. Well, the next day it was just the same thing over again, but everybody getting crosser, and at the end of a week's time so many people had lost their tempers that you could pick up lost tempers anywhere. They perfectly strewed the ground. Even when people tried to recover their tempers, they usually got somebody else's, and it made the most dreadful mix. The little girl began to get frightened, keeping the secret all to herself. She wanted to tell her mother, but she didn't dare to, and she was ashamed to ask the fairy to take back her gift. It seemed ungrateful and ill-bred, and she thought she would try to stand it. But she hardly knew how she could, for a whole year. So it went on, and it was Christmas on St. Valentine's Day, and Washington's birthday, just the same as any day, and it didn't skip even the 1st of April, though everything was counterfeit that day, and that was some little relief. After a while coal and potatoes began to be awfully scarce, so many had been wrapped up in tissue paper to fool papas and mammas with. Turkeys got to be about $1,000 apiece. Papa? Well, what? You're beginning to fib. Well, 2,000 then. And they got to passing off almost anything for turkeys, half-grown humming-birds, and even rocks out of the Arabian Nights. The real turkeys were so scarce. And cranberries, well, they asked a diamond apiece for cranberries. All the woods and orchards were cut down for Christmas trees, and where the woods and orchards used to be, it looked just like a stubble field with the stumps. After a while they had to make Christmas trees out of rags, and stuff them with bran like old-fashioned dolls. But there were plenty of rags, because people got so poor, buying presents for one another, that they couldn't get any new clothes, and they just wore their old ones to tatters. They got so poor that everybody had to go to the poorhouse, except the confectioners, and the fancy storekeepers, and the picture-book sellers, and the expressmen. And they all got so rich and proud that they would hardly wait upon a person when he came to buy. It was perfectly shameful. Well, after it had gone on about 3 or 4 months, the little girl, whenever she came into the room in the morning and saw those great, ugly, lumpy stockings dangling at the fireplace, and the disgusting presents around everywhere, used to just sit down and burst out crying. In 6 months she was perfectly exhausted. She couldn't even cry any more. She just lay on the lounge and rolled her eyes and panted. About the beginning of October she took to sitting down on dolls wherever she found them, French dolls or any kind. She hated the sight of them so, and by Thanksgiving she was crazy, and just slammed her presents across the room. By that time people didn't carry presents around nicely any more. They flung them over the fence, or through the window, or anything, and instead of running their tongues out and taking great pains to write "For dear Papa," or Mama, or Brother, or Sister, or Susie, or Sammy, or Billy, or Bobby, or Jimmy, or Jenny, or whoever it was, and troubling to get the spelling right, and then signing their names, and Xmas 18 what, they used to write in the gift books, "Take it, you horrid old thing," and then go and bang it against the front door. Nearly everybody had built barns to hold their presents, but pretty soon the barns overflowed, and then they used to let them lie out in the rain, or anywhere. Sometimes the police used to come and tell them to shovel their presents off the sidewalk, or they would arrest them. "I thought you said everybody had gone to the poorhouse," interrupted the little girl. "They did go, at first," said her papa, "but after a while the poor houses got so full that they had to send the people back to their own houses. They tried to cry, when they got back, but they couldn't make the least sound." "Why couldn't they?" "Because they had lost their voices saying 'Merry Christmas' so much. Did I tell you how it was on the 4th of July?" "No, how was it?" and the little girl nestled closer, in expectation of something uncommon. "Well, the night before, the boys stayed up to celebrate, as they always do, and fell asleep before 12 o'clock, as usual, expecting to be wakened by the bells and cannon. But it was nearly 8 o'clock before the first boy in the United States woke up, and then he found out what the trouble was. As soon as he could get his clothes on, he ran out of the house and smashed a big cannon torpedo down on the pavement. But it didn't make any more noise than a damp wad of paper; and after he tried about 20 or 30 more, he began to pick them up and look at them. Every single torpedo was a big raisin. Then he just streaked it upstairs and examined his firecrackers and toy pistol and $2 collection of fireworks, and found that they were nothing but sugar and candy painted up to look like fireworks. Before 10 o'clock every boy in the United States found out that his 4th of July things had turned into Christmas things, and then they just sat down and cried, they were so mad. There are about 20 million boys in the United States, and so you can imagine what a noise they made. Some men got together before night, with a little powder that hadn't turned into purple sugar yet, and they said they would fire off one cannon anyway. But the cannon burst into 1,000 pieces, for it was nothing but rock candy, and some of the men nearly got killed. The 4th of July orations all turned into Christmas carols, and when anybody tried to read the Declaration, instead of saying, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary," he was sure to sing, "God rest ye merry gentlemen." It was perfectly awful. The little girl drew a deep sigh of satisfaction. "And how was it at Thanksgiving?" Her papa hesitated. "Well, I'm almost afraid to tell you. I'm afraid you'll think it's wicked." "Well, tell anyway," said the little girl. "Well, before it came Thanksgiving, it had leaked out who had caused all these Christmases. The little girl had suffered so much that she had talked about it in her sleep, and after that hardly anybody would play with her. People just perfectly despised her, because if it had not been for her greediness it wouldn't have happened. And now, when it came Thanksgiving, and she wanted them to go to church and have squash pie and turkey and show their gratitude, they said that all the turkeys had been eaten up for her old Christmas dinners, and if she would stop the Christmases, they would see about the gratitude. Wasn't it dreadful? And the very next day the little girl began to send letters to the Christmas fairy, and then telegrams, to stop it. But it didn't do any good, and then she got to calling at the fairy's house, but the girl that came to the door always said, 'Not at home,' or 'Engaged,' or 'At dinner,' or something like that. And so it went on till it came to the old once-a-year Christmas Eve. The little girl fell asleep, and when she woke up in the morning—" "She found it was all nothing but a dream," suggested the little girl. "No, indeed," said her papa. "It was all every bit true." "Well, what did she find out then?" "Why, that it wasn't Christmas at last, and wasn't ever going to be, any more. Now it's time for breakfast." The little girl held her papa fast around the neck. "You shan't go if you're going to leave it so." "How do you want it left?" "Christmas once a year." "All right," said her papa, and he went on again. Well, there was the greatest rejoicing all over the country, and it extended clear up into Canada. The people met together everywhere, and kissed and cried for joy. The city carts went around and gathered up all the candy and raisins and nuts and dumped them into the river, and it made the fish perfectly sick. And the whole United States, as far out as Alaska, was one blaze of bonfires, where the children were burning up their gift books and presents of all kinds. They had the greatest time. The little girl went to thank the old fairy because she had stopped its being Christmas, and she said she hoped she would keep her promise and see that Christmas never, never came again. Then the fairy frowned, and asked her if she was sure she knew what she meant, and the little girl asked her why not. And the old fairy said that now she was behaving just as greedily as ever, and she'd better look out. This made the little girl think it all over carefully again, and she said she would be willing to have it Christmas about once in 1,000 years. And then she said 100, and then she said 10, and at last she got down to 1. Then the fairy said that was the good old way that had pleased people ever since Christmas began, and she was agreed. Then the little girl said, "What are your shoes made of?" And the fairy said, "Leather." And the little girl said, "Bargain's done forever," and skipped off, and hippity hopped the whole way home, she was so glad. "Now how will that do?" asked the papa. "First rate," said the little girl, but she hated to have the story stop, and was rather sober. However, her mamma put her head in at the door and asked her papa, "Are you never coming to breakfast? What have you been telling that child?" "Oh, just a moral tale." The little girl caught him round the neck again. "We know. Don't you tell what, papa, don't you tell what."
Betty stood at her door, gazing drearily down the long, empty corridor in which the breakfast gong echoed mournfully. All the usual brisk scenes of that hour, groups of girls in Peter Thompson suits or starched shirt-waists, or a pair of energetic ones, red-cheeked and shining-eyed from a run in the snow, had vanished as by the hand of some evil magician. Silent and lonely was the corridor. "And it's the day before Christmas," groaned Betty. 2 chill little tears hung on her eyelashes. The night before, in the excitement of getting the girls off with all their trunks and packages intact, she had not realized the homesickness of the deserted school. Now it seemed to pierce her very bones. "Oh, dear, why did Father have to lose his money? 'Twas easy enough last September to decide I wouldn't take the expensive journey home these holidays, and for all of us to promise we wouldn't give each other as much as a Christmas card. But now—" The 2 chill tears slipped over the edge of her eyelashes. "Well, I know how I'll spend this whole day. I'll come right up here after breakfast and cry and cry and cry." Somewhat fortified by this cheering resolve, Betty went to breakfast. Whatever the material joys of that meal might be, it certainly was not a feast of reason and a flow of soul. Betty, whose sense of humour never perished, even in such a frost, looked round the table at the 8 grim-faced girls doomed to a Christmas in school, and quoted mischievously to herself, "On with the dance, let joy be unconfined." Breakfast bolted, she lagged back to her room, stopping to stare out of the corridor windows. She saw nothing of the snowy landscape, however. Instead, a picture, the gayest medley of many colours and figures, danced before her eyes. Christmas trees thumping in through the door, mysterious bundles scurried into dark corners, little brothers and sisters flying about with festoons of mistletoe, scarlet ribbon and holly, everywhere sound and laughter and excitement. The motto of Betty's family was, "Never do today what you can put off till tomorrow." Therefore the preparations of a fortnight were always crowded into a day. The year before, Betty had rushed till her nerves were taut and her temper snapped, had shaken the twins, raged at the housemaid, and had gone to bed at midnight weeping with weariness. But in memory, only the joy of the day remained. I think I could endure this jail of a school, and not getting one single present, but it breaks my heart not to give one least little thing to anyone. Why, who ever heard of such a Christmas? Won't you hunt for that blue? Broken my thread again? Give me those scissors." Betty jumped out of her daydream. She had wandered into Cork, and the three O'Neills surrounded her, staring. "I beg your pardon. I heard you, and it was so like home the day before Christmas." "Did you hear the heathen rage?" cried Catherine. "Dolls for Aunt Anne's mission," explained Constance. "You're so forehanded that all your presents went a week ago, I suppose." Eleanor swept clear a chair. "The Clan O'Neill is never forehanded." "You'd think I was from the number of thumbs I've grown this morning. Oh, misery!" Eleanor jerked a snarl of thread out on the floor. Betty had never cared for Cork, but now the hot, worried faces of its girls appealed to her. "Let me help. I'm a regular silkworm." The O'Neills assented with eagerness, and Betty began to sew in a capable, swift way that made the others stare and sigh with relief. The dolls were many, the O'Neills slow. Betty worked till her feet twitched on the floor, yet she enjoyed the morning, for it held an entirely new sensation, that of helping someone else get ready for Christmas. "Done." "We never should have finished if you hadn't helped. Thank you, Betty Luther, very, very much." "You're a duck. Let's run to luncheon together, quick." Somehow the big corridors did not seem half so bleak, echoing to those warm O'Neill voices. "This morning's just spun by. But oh, this long, dreary afternoon," sighed Betty, as she wandered into the library. "Oh, me, there goes Alice Johns with her arms loaded with presents to mail, and I can't give a single soul anything. Do you know where Quotations for Occasions has gone?" Betty turned to face pretty Rosamond Howitt, the only senior left behind. "Gone to be rebound. I heard Miss Dyce say so." "Oh, dear, I needed it so. Could I help? I know a lot of rhymes and tags of proverbs and things like that." "Oh, if you would help me, I'd be so grateful. Won't you come to my room? You see, I promised a friend in town, who is to have a Christmas dinner and who's been very kind to me, that I'd paint the place cards and write some quotation appropriate to each guest. I'm shamefully late over it. My own gifts took such a time, but the painting at least is done." Rosamond led the way to her room, and there displayed the cards which she had painted. "You can't think of my helplessness. If it were a Greek verb now, or a lost and straight angle, but poetry." Betty trotted back and forth between the room and the library, delved into books, and even evolved a verse which she audaciously tagged "Old Play," in imitation of Sir Walter Scott. "I think they are really and truly very bright, and I know Mrs. Fernell will be delighted." Rosamond wrapped up the cards carefully. "I can't begin to tell you how you've helped me. It was sweet in you to give me your whole afternoon." The dinner bell rang at that moment, and the two went down together. "Come for a little run. I haven't been out all day," whispered Rosamond, slipping her hand into Betty's as they left the table. A great round moon swung cold and bright over the pines by the lodge. "Down the road a bit, just a little way, to the church," suggested Betty. They stepped out into the silent country road. "Why, the little mission is as gay as Christmas. I wonder why." Betty glanced at the bright windows of the small plain church. "Oh, some Christmas Eve doings," she answered. Someone stepped quickly out from the church door. "Oh, Miss Vernon, I'm relieved. I'd begun to fear you could not come." The girl saw it was the tall old rector, his white hair shining silver bright in the moonbeams. "We're just two girls from the school, sir," said Rosamond. "Dear, dear!" His voice was both impatient and distressed. "I hoped you were my organist. We are all ready for our Christmas Eve service, but we can do nothing without the music." "I can play the organ a little," said Betty. "I'd be glad to help." "You can? My dear child, how fortunate! But do you know the service?" "Yes, sir. It's my church." No vested choir stood ready to march triumphantly chanting into the choir stalls. Only a few boys and girls waited in the dim old choir loft, where Rosamond seated herself quietly. Betty's fingers trembled so at first that the music sounded dull and far away, but her courage crept back to her in the silence of the church, and the organ seemed to help her with a brave power of its own. In the dark church only the altar and a great gold star above it shone bright. Through an open window somewhere behind her she could hear the winter wind rattling the ivy leaves and bending the trees. Yet somehow she did not feel lonesome and forsaken this Christmas Eve, far away from home, but safe and comforted and sheltered. The voice of the old rector reached her faintly in pauses. Habit led her along the service, and the star at the altar held her eyes. Strange new ideas and emotions flowed in upon her brain. Tears stole softly into her eyes, yet she felt in her heart a sweet glow. Slowly the Christmas picture that had flamed and danced before her all day, painted in the glory of holly and mistletoe and tinsel, faded out, and another shaped itself, solemn and beautiful, in the altar light. "My dear child, I thank you very much." The old rector held Betty's hands in both his. "I cannot have a Christmas morning service. Our people have too much to do to come then. But I was especially anxious that our evening service should have some message, some inspiration for them, and your music has made it so. You have given me great aid. May your Christmas be a blessed one." "I was glad to play, sir. Thank you," answered Betty simply. "Let's run," she cried to Rosamond, and they raced back to school. She fell asleep that night without one smallest tear. The next morning Betty dressed hastily, and catching up her mandolin, set out into the corridor. Something swung against her hand as she opened the door. It was a great bunch of holly, glossy green leaves and glowing berries, and hidden in the leaves was a card. "Betty, Merry Christmas," was all, but only one girl wrote that dainty hand. "A winter rose," whispered Betty happily, and stuck the bunch into the ribbon of her mandolin. Down the corridor she ran until she faced a closed door. Then, twanging her mandolin, she burst out with all her power into a gay Christmas carol. High and sweet sang her voice in the silent corridor all through the gay carol. Then, sweeter still, it changed into a Christmas hymn. Then, from behind the closed doors sounded voices. "Merry Christmas, Betty Luther." Then Constance O'Neill's deep, smooth alto flowed into Betty's soprano, and at the last all 9 girls joined in Adeste Fideles. Christmas morning began with music and laughter. "This is your place, Betty. You are lord of Christmas morning." Betty stood blushing, red as the holly in her hand, before the breakfast table. Miss Hyle, the teacher at the head of the table, had given up her place. The breakfast was a merry one. After it somebody suggested that they all go skating on the pond. Betty hesitated and glanced at Miss Hyle and Miss Thrasher, the 2 sad-looking teachers. She approached them and said, "Won't you come skating too?" Miss Thrasher, hardly older than Betty herself, and pretty in a white frightened way, refused, but almost cheerfully. "I have a Christmas box to open and Christmas letters to write. Thank you very much." Betty's heart sank as she saw Miss Hyle's face. Goodness, she's coming! Miss Hyle was the most unpopular teacher in school. Neither ill-tempered nor harsh, she was so cold, remote, and rigid in face, voice, and manner that the warmest blooded shivered away from her. The least sensitive shrank. "I have no skates, but I should like to borrow a pair to learn, if I may. I have never tried it," she said. The tragedies of a beginner on skates are to the observer, especially if such be schoolgirls, subjects for unalloyed mirth. The 9 girls choked and turned their backs and even giggled aloud as Miss Hyle went prone, now backward with a whack, now forward in a limp crumple. But amusement became admiration. Miss Hyle stumbled, fell, laughed merrily, scrambled up, struck out, and skated. Presently she was swinging up the pond in stroke with Betty and Eleanor O'Neill. "Miss Hyle, you're great!" cried Betty at the end of the morning. "I've taught dozens and scores to skate, but never anybody like you. You've a genius for skating." Miss Hyle's blue eyes shot a sudden flash at Betty that made her whole severe face light up. "I've never had a chance to learn. At home there never is any ice, but I've always been athletic." "Where's your home, Miss Hyle?" asked Betty. "Cawnpore, India." "India!" gasped Eleanor. "How delightful! Oh, won't you tell us about it, Miss Hyle?" So it was that Miss Hyle found herself talking about something besides triangles to girls who really wanted to hear, and so it was that the flash came often into her eyes. "I've had a happy morning, thank you, Betty and all." She said it very simply, yet a quick throb of pity and liking beat in Betty's heart. How stupid we are about judging people, she thought. Yet Betty had always prided herself on her character reading. "Hurrah! The mail and express are in." The girls ran excitedly to their rooms. Betty alone went to hers without interest. "Why, Hilma, what's happened?" The little round-faced Swedish maid mopped the big tears with her duster and choked out, "Nothings, ma'am." "Of course there is. You're crying like everything." Hilma wept aloud. "Christmas Day it is, and mine family and mine friends have party now, all day." "Where?" Hilma jerked her head toward the window. "Oh, you mean in town? Why can't you go?" "I work, and never before am I from home Christmas Day." Betty shivered. "Never before am I from home Christmas Day," she whispered. She went close to the girl, very tall and slim and bright beside the dumpy, flaxen Hilma. "What work do you do?" "The cook. He cooks the dinner and the supper. I put it on and waited on the young ladies and wash the dishes. The others all are gone." Betty laughed suddenly. "Hilma, go put on your best clothes quick and go down to your party. I'm going to do your work." Hilma's eyes rounded with amazement. "The cook, he be mad." "No, he won't. He won't care whether it's Hilma or Betty if things get done all right. I know how to wait on tables and wash dishes. There's no housekeeper here to object. Run along, Hilma. Be back by 9 o'clock, and Merry Christmas." Hilma's face beamed through her tears. She was speechless with joy, but she seized Betty's slim brown hand and kissed it loudly. "What larks! Is it a joke? Betty, you're the handsomest butler." Betty, in a white shirtwaist suit, a jolly red bow pinned on her white apron, and a little cap cocked on her dark hair, waved them to their seats at the holly decked table. "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!" "Nobody is ill, Betty?" Rosamond asked anxiously. "If I had 3 guesses I should use every one that our maid wanted to go into town for the day." And Betty took her place. It was Miss Hyle's calm voice. Betty blushed. It was her turn now to flash back a glance, and those 2 sparks kindled the fire of friendship. It was a jolly Christmas dinner, with the butler eating with the family. And now the dishes, thought Betty. It must be admitted the washing up after a Christmas dinner of 12 is not a subject for much joy. "I propose we all help Betty wash the dishes," cried Rosamond Howitt. Out in the kitchen everyone laughed and talked and got in the way, and had a good time. And if the milk pitcher was knocked on the floor and the pudding bowl emptied in Betty's lap, why, it was all Merry Christmas. After that they all skated again. When they came in, little Miss Thrasher, looking almost gay in a rose-red gown, met them in the corridor. "I thought it would be fun," she said shyly, "to have supper in my room. I have a big box from home. I couldn't possible eat all the things myself, and if you'll bring chafing dishes and spoons and those things, I'll cook it, and we can sit around my open fire." Miss Thrasher's room was homelike, with its fire of white birch and its easy chairs, and Miss Thrasher herself proved to be a pleasant hostess. After supper, Miss Hyle told a tale of India, Miss Thrasher gave a Rocky Mountain adventure, and the girls contributed ghost and burglar stories till each guest was in a thrill of delightful horror. "We've had really a fine day. I expected to die of homesickness, but it's been jolly." "So did I, but I have actually been happy." Thus the girls commented as they started for bed. "I have enjoyed my day," said little Miss Thrasher, "very much." "Yes, indeed, it's been a merry Christmas." Miss Hyle spoke almost eagerly. Betty gave a little jump. She realized each one of them was holding her hand and pressing it a little. "Thank you. It's been a lovely evening. Good night." Rosamond had invited Betty to share her roommate's bed, but both girls were too tired and sleepy for any confidence. "It's been the queerest Christmas," thought Betty, as she drifted towards sleep. "Why, I haven't given one single soul one single present." Yet she smiled, drowsily happy. And then the room seemed to fill with a bright, warm light, and round the bed there danced a great Christmas wreath, made up of the faces of the 3 O'Neills, and the thin old rector with his white hair, and pretty Rosamond, and frightened Miss Thrasher, and the homesick girls, and lonely Miss Hyle, and tear-dimmed Hilma. And all the faces smiled and nodded, and called, "Merry Christmas, Betty! Merry Christmas!"
Chapter 1. The Play Box. At the sound of footsteps along the hall, Miss Terry looked up from the letter which she was reading for the 6th time. "Of course I would not see him," she said, pursing her lips into a hard line. "Certainly not." A bump on the library door, as from an opposing knee, did duty for a knock. "Bring the box in here, Nora," said Miss Terry, holding open the door for her servant, who was gasping under the weight of a packing case. "Set it down on the rug by the fireplace. I am going to look it over and burn up the rubbish this evening." She glanced once more at the letter in her hand, then with a sniff tossed it upon the fire. "Yes'm," said Nora, as she set down the box with a thump. She stooped once more to pick up something which had fallen out when the cover was jarred open. It was a pink papier-mâché angel, such as are often hung from the top of Christmas trees as a crowning symbol. Nora stood holding it between thumb and finger, staring amazedly. Who would think to find such a bit of frivolity in the house of Miss Terry? Her mistress looked up from the fire, where the bit of writing was writhing painfully, and caught the expression of Nora's face. "What have you there?" she asked, frowning, as she took the object into her own hands. "The Christmas angel!" she exclaimed under her breath. "I had quite forgotten it." Then, as if it burned her fingers, she thrust the little image back into the box and turned to Nora brusquely. "There, that's all. You can go now, Nora," she said. "Yes'm," answered the maid. She hesitated. "If you please'm, it's Christmas Eve." "Well, I believe so," snapped Miss Terry, who seemed to be in a particularly bad humor this evening. "What do you want?" Nora flushed, but she was hardened to her mistress's manner. "Only to ask if I may go out for a little while to see the decorations and hear the singing." "Decorations? Singing? Fiddlestick!" retorted Miss Terry, poker in hand. "What decorations? What singing?" "Why, all the windows along the street are full of candles," answered Nora. "Rows of candles in every house, to light the Christ child on his way when he comes through the city tonight." "Fiddlestick!" again snarled her mistress. "And choir boys are going about the streets, they say, singing carols in front of the lighted houses," continued Nora enthusiastically. "It must sound so pretty." "They had much better be at home in bed. I believe people are losing their minds." "Please'm, may I go?" asked Nora again. Nora had no Puritanic traditions to her account. Moreover, she was young and warm and enthusiastic. Sometimes the spell of Miss Terry's sombre house threatened her to the point of desperation. It was so this Christmas Eve, but she made her request with apparent calmness. "Yes, go along," assented her mistress ungraciously. "Thank you'm," said the servant demurely, but with a brightening of her blue eyes, and presently the area door banged behind her quick-retreating footsteps. Didn't take her long to get ready," muttered Miss Terry, giving the fire a vicious poke. She was alone in the house on Christmas Eve, and not a man, woman, or child in the world cared. Well, it was what she wanted. It was of her own doing. If she had wished... She sat back in her chair, with thin, long hands lying along the arms of it, gazing into the fire. A bit of paper there was crumbling into ashes. Alone on Christmas Eve. Even Nora had some relation with the world outside. Was there not a stalwart officer waiting for her on the nearest corner? Even Nora could feel a simple childish pleasure in candles and carols and merriment, and the old, old superstition. "Stuff and nonsense!" mused Miss Terry scornfully. "What is our Christmas, anyway? A time for shopkeepers to sell, and for foolish folks to kill themselves in buying. Christmas spirit? No. It is all humbug, all selfishness and worry, an unwholesome season of unnatural activities. I am glad I am out of it. I am glad no one expects anything of me, nor I of anyone. I am quite independent, blessedly independent of the whole foolish business, It is a good time to begin clearing up for the new year. I'm glad I thought of it. I've long threatened to get rid of the stuff that has been accumulating in that corner of the attic. Now I will begin." She tugged the packing case an inch nearer the fire. It was like Miss Terry to insist upon that nearer inch. Then she raised the cover. It was a box full of children's battered toys, old-fashioned and quaint. The toys in vogue 30, 40, 50 years earlier, when Miss Terry was a child. She gave a reminiscent sniff as she threw up the cover, and saw on the underside of it a big label of pasteboard, unevenly lettered. Play box of Tom Terry and Angelina Terry. "Humph!" she snorted. There was a great deal in that humph. It meant, yes, Tom's name had plenty of room, while poor little Angelina had to squeeze in as well as she could. How like Tom! This accounted for everything, even to his not being in his sister's house this very night. How unreasonable he had been! Miss Terry shrugged impatiently. Why think of Tom tonight? Years ago he had deliberately cut himself adrift from her interests. No need to think of him now. It was too late to appease her. But here were all these toys to be got rid of. The fire was hungry for them. Why not begin? Miss Terry stooped to poke over the contents of the box with lean, long fingers. In one corner thrust up a doll's arm, in another an animal's tail pointed heavenward. She caught glimpses of glitter and tinsel, wheels and fragments of unidentifiable toys. "What rubbish!" she said. "Yes, I'll burn them all. They are good for nothing else. I suppose some folks would try to give them away and bore a lot of people to death. They seem to think they are saving something that way. Nonsense! I know better. It is all foolishness, this craze for giving. Most things are better destroyed as soon as you are done with them. Why, nobody wants such truck as this. Now, could any child ever have cared for so silly a thing?" She pulled out a faded jumping jack and regarded it scornfully. "Idiotic! Such toys are demoralizing for children, weaken their minds. It is a shame to think how everyone seems bound to spoil children, especially at Christmas time. Well, no one can say that I have added to the shameful waste." Miss Terry tossed the poor jumping jack on the fire and eyed his last contortions with grim satisfaction. But as she watched, a quaint idea came to her. She was famous for eccentric ideas. "I will try an experiment," she said. "I will prove once for all my point about the Christmas spirit. I will drop some of these old toys out on the sidewalk and see what happens. It may be interesting." Chapter 2. Jack-in-the-Box. Miss Terry rose and crossed 2 rooms to the front window, looking out upon the street. A flare of light almost blinded her eyes. Every window opposite her along the block, as far as she could see, was illuminated with a row of lighted candles across the sash. The soft, unusual glow threw into relief the pretty curtains and wreaths of green, and gave glimpses of cozy interiors and flitting, happy figures. "What a waste of candles!" scolded Miss Terry. "Folks are growing terribly extravagant." The street was white with snow which had fallen a few hours earlier, piled in drifts along the curb of the little-traveled terrace. But the sidewalks were neatly shoveled and swept clean, as became the eminently respectable part of the city where Miss Terry lived. A long flight of steps with iron railing at the side led down from the front door, upon which a silver plate had for generations in decorous flourishes announced the name of Terry. Miss Terry returned to the play box and drew out between thumb and finger the topmost toy. It happened to be a wooden box, with a wire hasp for fastening the cover. Half unconsciously she pressed the spring, and a hideous Jack-in-the-Box sprang out to confront her with a squeak, a leering smile, and a red nose. Miss Terry eyed him with disfavor. "I always did hate that thing," she said. "Tom was continually frightening me with it, I remember." As if to be rid of unwelcome memories, she shut her mouth tight, even as she shut Jack back into his box, snapping the spring into place. "This will do to begin with," she thought. She crossed to the window, which she opened quickly, and tossed out the box, so that it fell squarely in the middle of the sidewalk. Then, closing the window and turning down the lights in the room behind her, Miss Terry hid in the folds of the curtain and watched to see what would happen to Jack. The street was quiet. Few persons passed on either side. At last she spied two little ragamuffins approaching. They seemed to be Jewish lads of the newsboy class, and they eyed the display of candles appraisingly. The smaller boy first caught sight of the box in the middle of the sidewalk. "Hello, what's this?" he grunted, making a dash upon it. "Gee, what's up?" responded the other, who was instantly at his elbow. "G'wan, let me look at it." The smaller boy drew away and pressed the spring of the box eagerly. Ping! Out popped the Jack into his astonished face, whereupon he set up a guffaw. "Give it here," commanded the bigger boy. "No, you let it alone. It's mine," asserted the other, edging away along the curbstone. "I saw it first. You can't have it." "Give it here. I saw it first myself. Hand it over or I'll smash you." The bigger boy advanced threateningly. "I won't," the other whimpered, clasping the box tightly under his jacket. He started to run, but the bigger fellow was too quick for him. He pounced across the sidewalk, and soon the twain were struggling in the snowdrift, pummeling one another with might and main. "I told you so," commented Miss Terry from behind the curtain. "Here's the first show of the beautiful Christmas spirit that is supposed to be abroad. Look at the little beasts fighting over something that neither of them really wants." Just then Miss Terry spied a blue-coated figure leisurely approaching. At the same moment an instinct seemed to warn the struggling urchins. "Cop!" said a muffled voice from the pile of arms and legs, and in an instant two black shadows were flitting down the street. But not before the bigger boy had wrenched the box from the pocket of the little chap. "So that is the end of experiment number 1," quoth Miss Terry, smiling grimly. "It happened just about as I expected. They will be fighting again as soon as they are out of sight. They are Jews, but that doesn't make any difference about the Christmas spirit. Now let's see what becomes of the next experiment." Chapter 3. The Flanton Dog. She returned to the play box by the fire and rummaged for a few minutes among the tangled toys. Then with something like a chuckle she drew out a soft, pale creature with 4 wobbly legs. "The Flanton Dog," she said. "Well, I vow! I had forgotten all about him. It was Tom who coined the name for him because he was made of Canton flannel." She stood the thing up on the table as well as his weak legs would allow, and inspected him critically. He certainly was a forlorn specimen. One of the black beads which had served him for eyes was gone. His ears, which had originally stood up saucily on his head, now drooped in limp dejection. One of them was a mere shapeless rag hanging by a thread. He was dirty and discolored, and his tail was gone. But still he smiled with his red thread mouth and seemed trying to make the best of things. "What a nightmare!" said Miss Terry contemptuously. "I know there isn't a child in the city who wants such a looking thing. Why, even the animal rescue folks would give the boys a free shot at that. "This isn't going to bring out any Christmas spirit," she sneered. "I will try it and see." Once more she lifted the window and tossed the dog to the sidewalk. He rolled upon his back and lay pathetically with crooked legs yearning upward, still smiling. Hardly had Miss Terry time to conceal herself behind the curtain when she saw a figure approaching, airily waving a stick. "No ragamuffin this time," she said. "Hello, it is that good-for-nothing young Cooper fellow from the next block. They say he is a millionaire. Well, he isn't even going to see the Flanton Dog." The young man came swinging along debonairly. He was whistling under his breath. He was a dapper figure in a long coat and a silk hat, under which the candles lighted a rather silly face. When he reached the spot in the sidewalk where the Flanton Dog lay, he paused a moment, looking down. Then he poked at the object with his stick. On the other side of the street a mother and her little boy were passing at the time. The child's eyes caught sight of the dog on the sidewalk, and he hung back, watching to see what the young man would do to it. But his mother drew him after her. Just then an automobile came panting through the snow. With a quick movement Cooper picked up the dog on the end of his stick and tossed it into the street, under the wheels of the machine. The baby across the street uttered a howl of anguish at the sight. Miss Terry herself was surprised to feel a pang shoot through her as the car passed over the queer old toy. She retreated from the window quickly. "Well, that's the end of Flanton," she said, with half a sigh. "I knew that fellow was a brute. I might have expected something like that. But it looked so. She hesitated for a word and did not finish her sentence, but bit her lip and sniffed cynically. Chapter 4. The Noah's Ark. Now, what comes next? Miss Terry rummaged in the box until her fingers met something odd-shaped, long and smooth-sided. With some difficulty she drew out the object, for it was of good size. The old Noah's Ark," she said. "I wonder if all the animals are in there." She lifted the cover and turned out into her lap the long imprisoned animals and their round-bodied chief. Mrs. Noah and her sons had long since disappeared, but the ark builder, hatless and one-armed, still presided over a menagerie of sorry beasts. Scarcely one could boast of being a quadruped. To few of them the years had spared a tail. From their close resemblance in their misery, it was not hard to believe in the kinship of all animal life. She took them up and examined them curiously one by one. Finally she selected a shapeless slate-colored block from the mass. "This was the elephant," she mused. "I remember when Tom stepped on him and smashed his trunk. I guess I'm going to be an expressman when I grow up," he said, looking sorry. Tom was always full of his jokes. "Now I'll try this and see what happens to the ark on its last voyage." Just then there was a noise outside. An automobile honked past, and Miss Terry shuddered, recalling the pathetic end of the Flanton Dog, which had given her quite a turn. "I hate those horrid machines," she exclaimed. "They seem like Juggernaut. I'd like to forbid their going through this street." She crowded the elephant with Noah and the rest of his charge back into the ark and closed the lid. "I can't throw this out of the window," she reflected. "They would spill. I must take it out on the sidewalk. Land, the fire's going out! That girl doesn't know how to build fires so they will keep." She laid the Noah's Ark on the table, and going to the closet, tugged out several big logs, which she arranged geometrically. About laying fires, as about most other things, Miss Terry had her own positive theories. Taking the bellows in hand, she blew furiously, and was presently rewarded with a brisk blaze. She smiled with satisfaction and trotted upstairs to find her red knit shawl. With this about her shoulders she was prepared to brave the December frost. Down the steps she went and deposited the ark discreetly at their foot, then returned to take up her position behind the curtains. There were a good many people passing, but they seemed too preoccupied to glance down at the sidewalk. They were nearly all hurrying in one direction. Some were running in the middle of the street. "They are in a great hurry," sniffed Miss Terry disdainfully. "One would think they had something really important on hand. I suppose they are going to hear the singing. Fiddlestick!" A man hastened by under the window. A woman, 2 children, a boy and a girl, running and gesticulating eagerly. None of them noticed the Noah's Ark lying at the foot of the steps. Miss Terry began to grow impatient. "Are they all blind?" she fretted. "What is the matter with them? I wish somebody would find the thing. I am tired of seeing it lying there." She tapped the floor impatiently with her slipper. Just then a woman approached. She was dressed in the most uncompromising of mourning, and she walked slowly, with bent head, never glancing at the lighted windows on either side. "She will see it," commented Miss Terry. And sure enough, she did. She stopped at the doorstep, drew her skirts aside, and bent over to look at the strange-shaped box at her feet. Finally she lifted it, but immediately she shivered and acted so strangely that Miss Terry thought she was about to break the toy in pieces on the steps or throw it into the street. Evidently she detested the sight of it. Just then up came a second woman with 2 small boys hanging at her skirts. They were ragged and sick-looking. There was something about the expression of even the tiny knot of hair at the back of the woman's head which told of anxious poverty. With envious curiosity she hurried up to see what a luckier mortal had found, crowding to look over her shoulder. The woman in black drew haughtily away and clutched the Noah's Ark with a gesture of proprietorship. "Go away. This is my affair." Miss Terry read her expression and sniffed. "There is the Christmas spirit coming out again," she said to herself. "Look at her face." The black-gowned woman prepared to move on with the toy under her arm. But the second woman caught hold of her skirt and began to speak earnestly. She pointed to the Noah's Ark, then to her 2 children. Her eyes were beseeching. The little boys crowded forward eagerly. But some wicked spirit seemed to have seized the finder of the Ark. Angrily she shook off the hand of the other woman, and clutching the box yet more firmly under her arm, she hurried away. Once, twice she turned and shook her head at the ragged woman who followed her. Then, with a savage gesture at the 2 children, she disappeared beyond Miss Terry's straining eyes. The poor woman and her boys followed forlornly at a distance. "They really wanted it, that old Noah's Ark!" exclaimed Miss Terry in amazement. "I can scarcely believe it. But why did that other creature keep the thing? I see. Only because she found they cared for it. Well, that is a happy spirit for Christmas time, I should say. Humph! I did not expect to find anything quite so mean as that." Chapter 5. Miranda. Miss Terry returned to the fireside, fumbled in the box, and drew out a doll. She was an ugly old-fashioned doll, with bruised waxen face of no particular color. Her mop of flaxen hair was straggling and uneven, much the worse for the attention of generations of moths. She wore a faded green silk dress in the style of Lincoln's day, and a primitive bonnet, evidently made by childish hands. She was a strange, dead-looking figure, with pale eyelids closed, as Miss Terry dragged her from the box. But when she was set upright, the lids snapped open, and a pair of bright blue eyes looked straight into those of Miss Terry. It was so sudden that the lady nearly gasped. "Miranda!" she exclaimed. "It is old Miranda. I have not thought of her for years." She held the doll at arm's length, gazing fixedly at her for some minutes. "I cannot burn her," she muttered at last. "It would seem almost like murder. I don't like to throw her away, but I have vowed to get rid of these things tonight. And I'll do it anyway. Yes, I'll make an experiment of her. I wonder what sort of trouble she will cause." Not even Miss Terry could think of seeing old Miranda lying exposed to the winter night. She found a piece of paper, rolled up the doll in a neat package, and tied it with red string. It was, to look upon, entirely a tempting package. Once more she stole down the steps and hesitated where to leave Miranda. Not on the sidewalk. For some reason that seemed impossible. But near the foot of the flight of steps leading to the front door she deposited the doll. The white package shone out plainly in the illuminated street. There was no doubt that it would be readily seen. With a quite unexplainable interest Miss Terry watched to see what would happen to Miranda. She waited for some time. The street seemed deserted. Miss Terry caught the faint sound of singing. The choristers were passing through a neighboring street, and doubtless all wayfarers within hearing of their voices were following in their wake. She was thoroughly interested in her grim joke, but she was becoming impatient. Were there to be no more passers? Must the doll stay there unreclaimed until morning? Presently she became aware of a child's figure drawing near. It was a little girl of about 10, very shabbily dressed, with tangled yellow curls hanging over her shoulders. There was something familiar about her appearance. Miss Terry could not say what it was. She came hurrying along the sidewalk with a preoccupied air, and seemed about to pass the steps without seeing the package lying there. But just as she was opposite the window, her eye caught the gleam of the white paper. She paused. She looked at it eagerly. It was such a tempting package, both as to its size and shape. She went closer and bent down to examine it. She took it into her bare little hands and seemed to squeeze it gently. There is no mistaking the contours of a doll, however well it may be enveloped in paper wrappings. The child's eyes grew more and more eager. She glanced behind her furtively. She looked up and down the street. Then, with a sudden intuition, she looked straight ahead up the flight of steps. Miss Terry read her mind accurately. She was thinking that probably the doll belonged in that house. Someone must have dropped the package while going out or in. Would she ring the bell and return it? Miss Terry had not thought of that possibility. But she shook her head and her lip curled. Return it? Of course not. Ragged children do not usually return promising packages which they have found, even on Christmas Eve. Look now. Once more the child glanced stealthily behind her, up and down the street. Once more she looked up at the dark house before her, the only black spot in a wreath of brilliancy. She did not see the face peering at her through the curtains, a face which scanned her own half wistfully. What was to become of Miranda? The little girl thrust the package under her ragged coat and ran away down the street as fast as her legs could take her. "A thief!" cried Miss Terry. "That is the climax. I have detected a child taking what she knew did not belong to her on Christmas Eve. Where are all their Sunday school lessons and their social improvement classes? I knew it. This Christmas spirit that one hears so much about is nothing but an empty sham. I have proved it to my satisfaction tonight. I will burn the rest of these toys, every one of them, and then go to bed. It is too disgusting. She was a nice-looking child, too. Poor old Miranda." With something like a sigh, Miss Terry strode back to the fire, where the play box stood gaping. She had made but a small inroad upon its heaped-up treasures. She threw herself listlessly into the chair and began to pull over the things. Broken games and animals, dolls' dresses painfully tailored by unskilled fingers, disjointed members, sorry relics of past pleasures. One by one, Miss Terry seized them between disdainful thumb and finger and tossed them into the fire. Her face showed not a qualm at parting with these childhood treasures, only the stern sense of a good housekeeper's duty fulfilled. With queer contortions the bits writhed on the coals, and finally flared into dissolution, vanishing up chimney in a shower of sparks to the heaven of spent toys. Chapter 6. The Christmas Angel. Almost at the bottom of the box Miss Terry's fingers closed about a small object. Once more she drew out the papier-mâché angel which had so excited the wonder of Nora when once before that evening it had come to light. Miss Terry held it up and looked at it with the same expression on her face, half tender, half contemptuous. "The Christmas angel," she murmured involuntarily, as she had done before, and again there flashed through her mind a vivid picture. It was the day before Christmas, 50 years earlier. She and her brother Tom were trimming the Christmas tree in this very library. She saw Tom in a white piqué suit with short socks that were always slipping down his fat legs. She saw herself in a white dress and blue ribbons, pouting in a corner. They had been quarreling about the Christmas tree, disputing as to which of them should light the first candle when the time arrived. Then their mother came to them smiling, a sweet-faced lady who seemed not to notice the red faces and the tears. She put something into Tom's hand, saying, "This is the Christmas angel of peace and goodwill. Hang it on the tree, children, so that it may shed a blessing on all who come here to give and to receive." How lovely and pink it looked in Tom's hand! Little Angelina had thought it the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and holy, too, as if it had some blessed charm. Fiddlestick! What queer fancies children have! Miss Terry remembered how a strange thrill had crept through Angelina as she gazed at it. Then she and Tom looked at each other and were ashamed of their quarrel. Suddenly Tom held out the angel to his sister. "You hang it on the tree, Angelina," he said magnanimously. "I know you want to." But she, little fool, she too had a fit of generosity. "No, you hang it, Tom. You're taller," she said. "I'll hang it at the very top of the tree," he replied, nothing loath. Eagerly he mounted the step-ladder, while Angelina watched him enviously, thinking how clumsy he was and how much better she could do it. How funny and fat Tom had looked on top of the ladder, reaching as high as he dared. The ladder began to wobble, and he balanced precariously, while Angelina clutched at his fat ankles with a scream of fright. But Tom said, "Ow! Angelina, let go my ankles. You hurt. Now don't scream. I shan't fall. Don't you know that this is the Christmas angel, and he will never let me get hurt on Christmas Eve?" Swaying wildly on one toe, Tom had clutched at the air, at the tree itself, anywhere for support. Yet almost as if by a miracle he did not fall, and the Christmas angel was looking down from the very top of the tree. Miss Terry laid the little pink figure in her lap and mused. "Mother was wise," she sighed. "She knew how to settle our quarrels in those days. Perhaps if she had still been here things would have gone differently. Tom might not have left me for good. For good!" She emphasized the words with a nod, as if arguing against something. Again she took up the Christmas angel and looked earnestly at it. Could it be that tears were glistening in her eyes? Certainly not. With a sudden sniff and jerk of the shoulders, she leaned forward, holding the Angel towards the fire. This should follow the other useless toys. But something seemed to stay her hand. She drew back, hesitated, then rose to her feet. "I can't burn it," she said. "It's no use, I can't burn it. But I don't want to see the thing around. I will put this out on the sidewalk, too. Possibly this may be different and do some good to somebody." She wrapped the shawl about her shoulders and once more ran down the steps. She left the Angel face upward in the middle of the sidewalk and retreated quickly to the house. As she opened the door to enter, she caught the distant chorus of fresh young voices singing in a neighboring square. Angels from the realms of glory, wing your flight o'er all the earth. When she took her place behind the curtain, she was trembling a little. She could not guess why. But now she watched with renewed eagerness. What was to be the fate of the Christmas Angel? Would he fall into the right hands and be hung upon some Christmas tree ere morning? Would he— Miss Terry held her breath. A man was staggering along the street toward her. He whistled noisily a vulgar song as he reeled from curb to railing, threatening to fall at every step. A drunken man on Christmas Eve. Miss Terry felt a great loathing for him. He was at the foot of the steps now. He was close upon the Angel. Would he see it, or would he tread upon it in his disgusting blindness? Yes. No. He saw the little pink image lying on the bricks, and with a lurch forward bent to examine it. Miss Terry flattened her nose against the pane eagerly. She expected to see him fall upon the Angel bodily. But no, he righted himself with a whoop of drunken mirth. "Angel," she heard him croak with maudlin accent. "Pink Angel, begorra. What doin' here, eh? Whoop! Go back to sky, Angel." And lifting a brutal foot, he kicked the image into the street. Then with a shriek of laughter he staggered away out of sight. Miss Terry found herself trembling with indignation. The idea! He had kicked the Christmas Angel, the very Angel that Tom had hung on their tree. It was sacrilege, or at least— Fiddlestick! Miss Terry's mind was growing confused. She had a sudden impulse to rescue the toy from being trampled into filthiness. The fire was better than that. She hurried down the steps into the street, forgetting her shawl. She sought in the snow and snatched the pink morsel to safety. Straight to the fire she carried it, and once more held it to the flames. But again she found it impossible to burn the thing. Once, twice she tried, but each time something seemed to clutch back her wrist. At last she shrugged impatiently and laid the Angel on the mantelpiece beside the square old marble clock, which marked the hour of 8:30. "Well, I won't burn it tonight," she reflected. "Somehow I can't do it just now. I don't see what has got into me. But tomorrow I will. Yes, tomorrow I will." She sat down in the armchair and fumbled in the old play box for the remaining scraps. There were but a few meaningless bits of ribbon and gauze, with the end of a Christmas candle, the survivor of some past festival, burned on some tree in the past. All these but the last she tossed into the fire, where they made a final protesting blaze. The candle end fell to the floor unnoticed. "There! That is the last of the stuff," she exclaimed with grim satisfaction, shaking the dust from her black silk skirt. "It is all gone now, thank heaven, and I can go to bed in peace. No, I forgot Nora. I suppose I must sit up and wait for her. Bother the girl! She ought to be in by now. What can she find to amuse her all this time? Christmas Eve. Fiddlestick! But I have got rid of a lot of rubbish tonight, and that is worth something." She sank back in her chair and clasped her hands over her breast with a sigh. She felt strangely weary. Her eyes sought the clock once more, and doing so rested upon the Christmas Angel lying beside it. She frowned and closed her eyes to shut out the sight, with its haunting memories and suggestions. Chapter 7. Before the Fire. Suddenly there was a volume of sound outside, and a great brightness filled the room. Miss Terry opened her eyes. The fire was burning red, but a yellow light, as from thousands of candles, shone in at the window, and there was the sound of singing, the sweetest singing that Miss Terry had ever heard. An angel of the Lord came down, and glory shone around. The words seemed chanted by the voices of young angels. Miss Terry passed her hands over her eyes and glanced at the clock. But what the hour was she never noticed, for her gaze was filled with something else. Beside the clock, in the spot where she had laid it a few minutes before, was the Christmas Angel. But now, instead of lying helplessly on its back, it was standing on rosy feet, with arms outstretched toward her. Over its head fluttered gauzy wings. From under the yellow hair which rippled over the shoulders, 2 blue eyes beamed kindly upon her, and the mouth widened into the sweetest smile. "Peace on earth to men of good will," cried the Angel, and the tone of his speech was music, yet quite natural and thrilling. Miss Terry stared hard at the Angel and rubbed her eyes, saying to herself, "Fiddlestick! I am dreaming." But she could not rub away the vision. When she opened her eyes, the Angel still stood tiptoe on the mantel shelf, smiling at her and shaking his golden head. "Angelina," said the Angel softly, and Miss Terry trembled to hear her name thus spoken for the first time in years. "Angelina, you do not want to believe your own eyes, do you? But I am real, more real than the things you see every day. You must believe in me. I am the Christmas Angel." "I know it." Miss Terry's voice was hoarse and unmanageable, as of one in a nightmare. "I remember." "You remember," repeated the Angel. "Yes, you remember the day when you and Tom hung me on the Christmas tree. You were a sweet little girl then, with blue eyes and yellow curls. You believed the Christmas story and loved Santa Claus. Then you were simple and affectionate and generous and happy." "Fiddlestick!" Miss Terry tried to say, but the word would not come. "Now you have lost the old belief and the old love," went on the Angel. "Now you have studied books and read wise men's sayings. You understand the higher criticism and the higher charity and the higher egoism. You don't believe in mere giving. You don't believe in the Christmas economics. You know better. But are you happy, dear Angelina?" Again Miss Terry thrilled at the sound of her name so sweetly spoken, but she answered nothing. The Angel replied for her. "No, you are not happy, because you have cut yourself off from the things that bring folk together in peace and goodwill at this holy time. Where are your friends? Where is your brother tonight? You are still hard and unforgiving to Tom. You refused to see him today, though he wrote so boyishly, so humbly and affectionately. You have not tried to make any soul happy. You don't believe in me, the Christmas spirit. There is such a word as fiddlestick, whatever it may mean, but Miss Terry's mind and tongue were unable to form it. "The Christmas spirit," continued the Angel, What is life worth if one cannot believe in the Christmas spirit? With a powerful effort Miss Terry shook off her nightmare sufficiently to say, "The Christmas spirit is no real thing. I have proved it tonight. It is not real. It is a humbug." "Not real? A humbug?" repeated the Angel softly. "And you have proved it, Angelina, this very night?" Miss Terry nodded. "I know what you have done," said the Angel. "I know very well. How keen you were! How clever! You made a test of chance to prove your point." Again Miss Terry nodded with complacency. "What knowledge of the world! What grasp of human nature!" commented the Angel, smiling. "It is like you mere mortals to say, 'I will make my test in my own way. If certain things happen, I shall foresee what the result must be. If certain other things happen, I shall know that I am right. Events fall out as you expect, and you smile with satisfaction, feeling your wisdom justified. It ought to make you happy. But does it?" Miss Terry regarded the Angel doubtfully. "Look now," he went on, holding up a rosy finger. "You are so near-sighted. You are so unimaginative. You do not dream beyond the thing you see. You judge the tale finished while the best has yet to be told. And you stake your faith, your hope, your charity upon this blind human judgment, which is mere chance." Miss Terry opened her lips to say, "I saw," but the Angel interrupted her. "You saw but the beginning," he said. "You saw but the first page of each history. Shall I turn over the leaves and let you read what really happened? Shall I help you see the whole truth instead of a part? On this night holy truth, which is of heaven, comes for all men to see and to believe. Look." Chapter 8. Jack Again. The Christmas Angel gently waved his hand to and fro. Gradually, as Miss Terry sat back in her chair, the library grew dark, or rather, things faded into an indistinguishable blur. Then it seemed as if she were sitting at a theatre, gazing at a great stage. But at this theatre there was nothing about her, nothing between her and the place where things were happening. First she saw two little ragamuffins quarreling over something in the snow. She recognized them. They were the two Jewish boys who had picked up the Jack-in-the-Box. An officer appeared, and they ran away, the bigger boy having possession of the toy, the smaller one with fists in his eyes, bawling with disappointment. Miss Terry's lips curled with the cynical disgust which she had felt when first witnessing this scene. But a sweet voice, and she knew it was the Angel's, whispered in her ear, "Wait and see." She watched the two boys run through the streets until they came to a dark corner. There the little fellow caught up with the other, and once more the struggle began. It was a hard and bloody fight, but this time the victory was with the smaller lad, who used his fists and feet like an enraged animal, until the other howled for mercy and handed over the disputed toy. "What you want it for, Sam?" he blubbered, as he saw it go into the little fellow's pocket. "Mind your own business. I just want it," answered Sam surlily. "Betcha I know," taunted the bigger boy. "Betcha you don't." "Do." "Don't." Another fight seemed imminent, but wisdom prevailed with Sammy. He would not challenge fate a third time. "Come on then and see," he grunted. And Ike followed. Off the two trudged through the brilliantly lighted streets until they came to a part of the city where the ways were narrower and dark. "Huh, knowed you was comin' here," commented Ike as they turned into a grim, dirty alley. Little Sam growled, "Didn't. apparently as a matter of habit. "Did," reasserted Ike. "Just where I was comin' myself." Sam turned to him with a grin. "Was you now? By, ain't that funny? I thought of it right off." "Sure, same here." They both burst into a guffaw and executed an impromptu double shuffle of delight. They were at the door of a tenement house with steep stairs leading into darkness. Up 3 flights pounded the 2 pairs of heavy boots, till they reached a half-opened door, whence issued the clatter of a sewing machine and the voices of children. Sam stood on the threshold grinning debonairly, with hands thrust into his pockets. Ike peered over his shoulder, also grinning. It was a meagre room into which they gazed, a room the chief furniture of which seemed to be babies. 2 little ones sprawled on the floor. A 3rd tiny tot lay in a broken-down carriage beside the door. A pale, ill-looking woman was running the machine. On the cot bed was crumpled a fragile little fellow of about 5, and a small pair of crutches lay across the foot of the bed. When the 2 boys appeared in the doorway, the woman stopped her machine, and the children set up a howl of pleasure. "Sammy! Ikey!" cried the woman, smiling a wan welcome as the babies crept and toddled toward the newcomers. "Where you come from?" "Been to see the shops and the lights and the swell houses," answered Sammy with a grimace. "Gee, ain't they wastin' candles to beat the cars!" "Enough to last a family a whole year," muttered Ike with disgust. The woman sighed. "Maybe they ain't wasted exactly," she said. "How I'd like to see 'em! But I got to finish this job. I told the children they mustn't expect anything this Christmas, but they're too little to know the difference anyway. All but Joe. I wish I had something for Joe." "I got something for Joe," said Sammy unexpectedly. The face of the pale little cripple lighted. "What is it?" he asked eagerly. "Oh, what is it? A real Christmas present for me?" "Naw, it ain't a Christmas present," said Sam. "We don't care anything about Christmas," volunteered Ikey with a grin. Sam looked at him with a frown of rebuke. "It's just a present," he said, "and it didn't cost a cent. I didn't buy it. We found it." "Found it in the street?" Joe's eyes shone. "Yeah," the boys nodded. "Oh, it is a Christmas present!" cried Joe. "Santa Claus must have dropped it there for me because he knew we hadn't any chimney in this house, and he sent you kind, kind boys to bring it to me." The 2 urchins looked sideways at each other, but said nothing. Presently Sam drew out the box from his pocket and tried to thrust it into Ike's hand. "You give it to 'em," he said. "You're the biggest." "Naw, you give it. You found it," protested Ike. "Ah, g'wan!" "Big fool!" There was a tussle, and it almost seemed as if the past unpleasantness was to be repeated from an opposite cause. But Joe's voice settled the dispute. "Oh, Sammy, please!" he cried. "I can't wait another minute. Do please give it to me now." At these words Sam stepped forward without further argument and laid the box on the bed in front of the little cripple. The babies crowded about. The mother left her machine and stood smiling faintly at the foot of the bed. Joe pressed the spring. Ping! Out sprang the jack-in-the-box, with the same red nose, the same leer, the same roguish eyes which had surprised the children of 50 years ago. Jack was always sure of his audience. My, how they screamed and begged Joe to do it again! And as for Joe, he lay back on his pillow and laughed as though he would never stop. It was the first Jack any of them had seen. Tears stood in the mother's eyes. "Well," she said, "it's as good as a play to see him. Joe hasn't laughed like that for months." You boys have done him lots of good. I wouldn't wonder if it helped him get well. If you was Christians, I'd say you showed the real Christmas spirit. But Lord, perhaps you do all the same. I dunno." Sam and Ike were so busy playing with the children that they did not hear. Gradually the tenement house faded and became a blur before Miss Terry's eyes. Once more she saw the mantel shelf before her, and the Christmas angel with outstretched arms waving to and fro. "You see," he said, "you did not guess all the pleasure that was shut up in that box with old Jack, did you?" Miss Terry shook her head. "And you see how different it all was from what you thought. Now let us see what became of the Canton flannel dog." "The Flanton dog." Miss Terry amended the phrase under her breath. It seemed so natural to use Tom's word. "Yes, the Flanton dog," the Angel smiled. "What do you think became of him?" "I saw what became of him," said Miss Terry. "Bob Cooper threw him under an automobile, and he was crushed flatter than a pancake." "Then you left the window," said the Angel. "In your human way you assumed that this was the end. But wait and see." Once more the room darkened and blurred, and Miss Terry looked out upon past events as upon a busy, ever-shifting stage. Chapter 9. The Dog Again. She saw the snowy street into which, from the tip of his stick, Bob Cooper had just tossed the Flanton dog. She saw, what she had not seen before, the woman and child on the opposite side of the street. She saw the baby stretch out wistful hands after the dog lying in the snow. Then an automobile honked past, and she felt again the thrill of horror as it ran over the poor old toy. At the same moment the child screamed, and she saw it point tearfully at the Flanton tragedy. The mother, who had seen nothing of all this, stooped and spoke to him reprovingly. "What's the matter, Johnny?" she said. "Shh! Don't make such a noise. Here we are at Mrs. Wales's gate, and you mustn't make a fuss. Now be a good boy and wait here till Mother comes out." She rang the area bell and stood, basket in hand, waiting to be admitted. But Johnny gazed at one spot in the street, with eyes full of tears, and with now and then a sob gurgling from his throat. He could not forget what he had seen. The door opened for the mother, who disappeared inside the house with one last command to the child. "Now be a good boy, Johnny. I'll be back in half a minute." Hardly was she out of sight when Johnny started through the snowdrift toward the middle of the street. With difficulty he lifted his little legs out of the deep snow. Now and then he stumbled and fell into the soft mass. But he rose only the more determined upon his errand, and kept his eyes fixed on the wreck of the Flanton dog. Bob Cooper, who was idly strolling up and down the block, smoking a cigarette as he watched the flitting girlish shadows in a certain window opposite, saw the child's frantic struggles in the snow, and was intensely amused. "By Jove!" he chuckled. "I believe he's after the wretched dog I tossed over there with my stick. Fancy it!" And carelessly he puffed a whiff of smoke. At last the baby reached the middle of the street and stooped to pick up the battered toy. It was flattened and shapeless, but the child clasped it tenderly and began to coo softly to it. "By Jove!" repeated Cooper. "Fancy caring so much about anything. Poor kid, perhaps that is all the Christmas he will have." He blew a thoughtful puff through his nose. Christmas Eve. The thought flashed through his mind with a new appeal. Just then came a sudden honk, honk. An automobile had turned the corner and was coming up at full speed. It was the same machine which had passed a few minutes earlier in the opposite direction. "Hey there!" Cooper yelled to the child, but the latter was sitting in the snow in the middle of the street, rocking back and forth with the Flanton Dog in his arms. There was scarcely time for action. Bob dropped his cigarette and his cane, made one leap into the street and another to the child, and by the impact of his body threw the baby into the drift at the curb. With a horrified honk, the automobile passed over the young man, who lay senseless in the snow. He was not killed. Miss Terry saw him taken to his home close by, where his broken leg was set and his bruises attended to. She saw him lying bandaged and white on his bed when the woman and her child were brought to see him. Johnny was still clasping closely the unlucky Flanton Dog. "Well, kid," said the young man feebly, "so you saved the dog after all." "Oh, sir," cried the poor woman, weeping, "only to think that he would not be here now but for you! What a Christmas that would have been for me! You were so good, so brave!" "Oh, rot!" protested Bob faintly. "Had to do it. My fault, anyway. Christmas Eve. Couldn't see a kid hurt on Christmas Eve." He called the attendant and asked for the pocketbook which had been in his coat at the time of the accident. Putting it into the woman's hand, he said, "Good-bye. Get Johnny something really jolly for Christmas. I'm afraid the dog is about all in. Get him a new one." But Johnny refused to have a new dog. It was the poor shapeless Flanton animal which remained the darling of his heart for many a moon. All this of past and future Miss Terry knew through the angel's power. When once more the library lightened, and she saw the pink figure smiling at her from the mantel, she spoke of her own accord. "It was my fault, because I put the dog in the way. I caused all that trouble." "Trouble?" said the Angel, puzzled. "Do you call it trouble? Do you not see what it has done for that heartless youth? It brought his good moment. Perhaps he will be a different man after this. And as for the child, he was made happy by something that would otherwise have been wasted, and he has gained a friend who will not forget him. Trouble? And do you think you did it?" He laughed knowingly. "I certainly did," said Miss Terry firmly. "But it was I, yes, I, the Christmas spirit, who put it into your head to do what you did. You may not believe it, but so it was. You too, even you, Angelina, could not quite escape the influence of the Christmas spirit, and so these things have happened. But now let us see what became of the third experiment." Chapter 10. Noah Again. In the Street of Candles a woman dressed all in black had picked up the poor old Noah's Ark and was looking at it wildly. She was a widow who had just lost her only child, a little son, and she was in a state of morbid bitterness bordering on distraction. When the second woman with the two little ones came up and begged for the toy, something hard and sullen and cruel rose in the widow's heart, and she refused angrily to give up the thing. She hated those two boys who had been spared when her own was taken. She would not make them happy. "No, you shall not have it," she cried, clutching the Noah's Ark fiercely. "I will destroy it." The poor woman and the children followed her wistfully. The little boys were crying. They were cold and hungry and disappointed. They had come so near to something pleasant. They had almost been lucky, but the luck had passed over their heads to another. The woman in mourning strode on rapidly, the thoughts within her no less black than the garments which she wore. She hated the world. She hated the people who lived in it. She hated Christmas time, when everyone seemed merry except herself. And yes, yes, most of all she hated children. She clenched her teeth wickedly. Her mind reeled. Suddenly, somewhere, A chorus of happy voices began to sing the words of an old carol. Holy night, peaceful night, all is dark save the light. Yonder where they sweet vigil keep o'er the babe who in silent sleep rests in heavenly peace. Softly and sweetly the childish voices ascended from the street. The woman in black stopped short, breathing hard. She saw the band of choristers standing in a group on the sidewalk and in the snow, their hats pulled down over their eyes, their collars turned up around their ears, their hands deep in pockets. In their midst rose the tall wooden cross carried by a little fellow with yellow hair. They sang as simply and as heartily as a flock of birds out in the snow. The woman gave a great sob. Her little lad had been a choir boy. Perhaps these were his one-time comrades. The second verse of the carol rang out sweetly. Holy night, peaceful night, only for shepherd's sight came blessed visions of angel throngs, with their loud hallelujah songs, saying, Jesus is come. Suddenly it seemed to the distracted mother that her own boy's voice blended with those others. He, too, was singing in honor of that child. Happy and ever young, he was bidding her rejoice in the day which made all childhood sacred. And for his sake she had been hating children. With a sudden revulsion of feeling, she turned to see what had become of the poor mother and her boys. They were not far behind, huddling in the shadow. The black woman strode quickly up to them. They shrank pitifully at her approach, and she felt the shame of it. They were afraid of her. Here, she said, thrusting the Noah's Ark into the hands of the larger boy. Take it. It belongs to you. The child took it timidly. The mother began to protest thanks. Trying to control the shake in her voice, the dark lady spoke again. Have you prepared a Christmas for your children? The woman shook her head. I have nothing, she sighed. A roof over our heads, that's all. Your husband? My man died a month ago. So other folk had raw sorrows too. The mourner had forgotten that. There is no one expecting you at home? Again the woman shook her head dolefully. Come with me, said the dark lady impulsively. You shall be my guests tonight, and tomorrow I will make a Christmas for the children. The house shall put off its shadow. I too will light candles. I have toys, her voice broke, and clothing, many things which are being wasted. That is not right. Something led you to me, or me to you. Something, perhaps it was an angel. Whoever dropped that Noah's Ark in the street? An angel might do that, I believe. Come with me. The woman and her sons followed her, rejoicing greatly in the midst of their wonder. There were tears in the eyes through which Miss Terry saw once more the Christmas angel. She wiped them hastily, but still the angel seemed to shine with a fairer radiance. You see, was all he said, and Miss Terry bowed her head. She began to understand. Chapter 11. Miranda Again. Once more, on the wings of vision, Miss Terry was out in the snowy street. She was following the fleet steps of a little girl who carried a white paper package under her arm. Miss Terry knew that she was learning the fate of her old doll, Miranda, whom her own hands had thrust out into a cold world. Poor Miranda! After all these years to become the property of a thief! Mary was the little thief's name. Hugging the tempting package close, Mary ran and ran until she was out of breath. Her one thought was to get as far as possible from the place where the bundle had lain, for she suspected that the steps where she had found it led up to the doll's home. That was why, in her own eyes also, she was a little thief. But now she had run so far and had turned so many corners that she could not find her way back if she would. There was triumph in the thought. Mary chuckled to herself as she stopped running and began to walk leisurely in the neighborhood with which she was more familiar. She pinched the package gently. Yes, there could be no doubt about it. It was a doll. Not a very large doll, but Mary reflected that she had never thought she should care for a large doll. Undoubtedly it was a very nice one. Had she not found it in a swell part of the city, on the steps of a swell-looking house? Mary gloated over the doll as she fancied it, with real hair and eyes that opened and shut, with 4 little white teeth and hands with dimples in the knuckles. She had seen such dolls in the windows of the big shops, but she had never hoped to have one for her very own. "Maybe it will have on a blue silk dress and white kid shoes, like that one I saw this morning," she mused rapturously. She pinched the spot where she fancied the doll's feet ought to be. "Yes, she's got shoes, sure enough. I bet they're white, too. They feel white. Oh, what fun I shall have with her!" She hugged the doll fondly. "If Uncle and Aunt don't take her away." The sudden thought made her stand still in horror. "They sold Mother's little clock for rum," she said bitterly. "They sold the ring with the red stone that Father gave me on my birthday when I was 7. They sold the presents that I got at Sunday school last year. Oh, wouldn't it be dreadful if they should sell my new doll? And I know they will want to if they see her." She squeezed the bundle closer with the prescient pang of parting. "Maybe they'll be out somewhere." With this faint hope she reached the tenement and crept up the dingy stairs. She peeped in at the door. Alas! Her uncle and aunt were in the kitchen, through which she had to pass. They had company, some dirty-looking men and women, and there were a jug and glasses on the table before them. Mary's heart sank, but she nodded bravely to the company and tried to slip through the crowd to the other room. But her aunt was quick to see that she carried something under her coat. "What you got there? A Christmas present?" she sneered. Mary flushed. "No," she said slowly. "Just something I found." "Found? Hello, what is it? A package." Her uncle advanced and snatched it from her. "Please," pleaded Mary. "Please, I found it. It is mine. I think it is only a doll." "A doll? Huh! Who needs a doll?" hiccuped her uncle. "We want something more to drink. We'll sell it." A bellow of laughter resounded through the room. The paper being torn roughly away, poor Miranda stood revealed in all her faded beauty. The pallid waxen face, straggling hair, and old-fashioned dress presented a sorry sight to the greedy eyes which had expected to find something exchangeable for drink. A sorry sight she was to Mary, who had hoped for something so much lovelier. A flush of disappointment came into her cheek, and tears to her eyes. "Here, take your old doll," said her uncle roughly, thrusting it into her arms. "Take your old doll and get away with her. If that's the best you can find, you'd better steal something next time." Steal something! Had she not in fact stolen it? Mary knew very well that she had, and she flushed pinker yet to think what a fool she had made of herself for nothing. She took the despised doll and retreated into the other room, followed by a chorus of jeers and comments. She banged the door behind her and sat down with poor Miranda on her knees, crying as if her heart would break. She had so longed for a beautiful doll. It did seem too cruel that when she found one it should turn out to be so ugly. She seized poor Miranda and shook her fiercely. "You horrid old thing!" she said. "Ain't you ashamed to fool me so? Ain't you ashamed to make me think you was a lovely doll with pretty clothes and white kid shoes? Ain't you?" She shook Miranda again until her eyeballs rattled in her head. The doll fell to the floor and lay there with closed eyes. Her face was pallid and ghastly. Her bonnet had fallen off, and her hair stuck out wildly in every direction. Her legs were doubled under her in the most helpless fashion. She was the forlornest figure of a doll imaginable. Presently Mary drew her hands away from her eyes and looked down at Miranda. There was something in the doll's attitude as she lay there which touched the little girl's heart. Once she had seen a woman who had been injured in the street. She would never forget it. The poor creature's eyes had been closed, and her face, under the fallen bonnet, was of this same pasty color. Mary shuddered. Suddenly she felt a warm rush of pity for the doll. "You poor old thing!" she exclaimed, looking at Miranda almost tenderly. "I'm sorry I shook you. You look so tired and sad and homesick. I wonder if somebody is worrying about you this minute. It was very wicked of me to take you away. On Christmas Eve, too. I wish I had left you where I found you. Maybe some little girl is crying now because you are lost." Mary stooped and lifted the doll gently upon her knees. As she took Miranda up, the blue eyes opened and seemed to look full at her. Miranda's one beauty was her eyes. Mary felt her heart grow warmer and warmer toward the quaint stranger. "You have lovely eyes," she murmured. "I think after all you are almost pretty. Perhaps I should grow to like you awfully. You are not a bit like the doll I hoped to have, but that is not your fault." A thought made her face brighten. "Why, if you had been a beautiful doll, they would have taken you away and sold you for rum." Her face expressed utter disgust. She hugged Miranda close with a sudden outburst of affection. "Oh, you dear old thing!" she cried. "I am so glad you are just like this. I am so glad, for now I can keep you always and always, and no one will want to take you away from me." She rocked to and fro, holding the doll tightly to her heart. Mary was not one to feel a half passion about anything. "I will make you some new dresses," she said, fingering the old-fashioned silk with a puzzled air. "I wonder why your mother dressed you so queerly. She was not much of a sewer if she made this bonnet." Scornfully she took off the primitive bonnet and smoothed out the tangled hair. "I wonder what you have on underneath," she said. With gentle fingers she began to undress Miranda. Off came the green silk dress with its tight basque and overskirt. Off came the ruffled petticoat and little chemise edged with fine lace. And Miranda stood in shapeless, kid-bodied ugliness, which stage of evolution the doll of her day had reached. But there was something more. Around her neck she wore a ribbon. On the ribbon was a cardboard medal, and on the medal a childish hand had scratched the legend, "Miranda Terry. If lost, please return to her mother, Angelina Terry, 87 Overlook Terrace." It was such a card as Miss Terry herself had worn in the days when her mother had first let her and Tom go out on the street without a nurse. Mary stared hard at the bit of cardboard. 87 Overlook Terrace. Yes, that was where she had found the doll. She remembered now seeing the name on a street corner. Miranda. What a pretty name for a doll. Angelina Terry. So that was the name of the little girl who had lost Miranda. Angelina must be feeling very sorry now. Perhaps she was crying herself to sleep, for it was growing late. Her two girl cousins came romping into the bedroom. They had been having a hilarious evening. "Hello, Mary!" they cried. "We heard about your great find. Playing with your old doll, are you? Going to hang up her stocking and see if Santa Claus will fill it? Huh! Santa Claus won't come to this house, I guess." Mary had almost forgotten that it was Christmas Eve. There had been nothing in the house to remind her. Perhaps Angelina Terry had hung up a stocking for Miranda at 87 Overlook Terrace, but there would be no Miranda to see it the next morning. Her cousins teased her for some time while they undressed, and Mary grew sulky. She sat in her corner and answered them shortly. But presently the room was quiet, for the girls slept easily. Then Mary crept into her little cot with the doll in her arms. She loved Miranda so much that she would never part with her. No, indeed, not even though she now knew where Miranda belonged. 87 Overlook Terrace. The figures danced before her eyes maliciously. She wished she could forget them. And the thought of Angelina Terry kept coming to her. Poor Angelina. "She ain't poor Angelina," argued Mary to herself. "She's rich Angelina. Doesn't she live in a big house in the swell part of the city? I s'pose she has hundreds of dolls, much handsomer than Miranda, and lots of other toys. I guess she won't miss this one queer old doll. I guess she'd let me keep it if she knew I hadn't any of my own. I guess it ought to be my doll. Anyway, I'm going to keep her. I don't believe Angelina loves Miranda so much as I do." She laid her cheek against the doll's cold waxen one, and presently fell asleep. But she slept uneasily. In the middle of the night she awoke, and lay for hours tossing and unhappy in the stuffy little room. The clock struck 1, 2, 3. At last she gave a great sigh, and cuddling Miranda in her arms turned over, with peace in her heart. "I will play you are mine, my very own dolly, for just this one night," she whispered in Miranda's ear. "Tomorrow will be Christmas Day, and I will take you back to your little mother, Angelina Terry. I can't do a mean thing at Christmas time, not even for you, dear Miranda." Thereupon she fell into a peaceful sleep. Chapter 12. The Angel Again. "Will she bring it back?" asked Miss Terry eagerly, when once more she found herself under the gaze of the Christmas Angel. He nodded brightly. "To-morrow morning you will see," he said. "It will prove that all I have shown you is really true." "A pretty child," said Miss Terry musingly. "A very nice child indeed. I believe she looks very much as I used to be myself." "You see, she is not a thief after all. Not yet," said the Angel. "What a pity that she must live in that sad home with such terrible people. A sensitive child like her, craving sympathy and affection, what chance has she for happiness? What would you yourself have been in surroundings like hers?" "Yes, she is very like what I was. Of course I shall let her keep the doll." Miss Terry hesitated. The Angel looked at her steadily, and his glance seemed to read her half-formed thoughts. "Surely," he said. "It seems to belong to her, does it not? But is this all? I wonder if something more does not belong to her." "What more?" asked Miss Terry shortly. "A home!" cried the Angel. Miss Terry groped in her memory for a scornful ejaculation which she had once been fond of using, but there was no such word to be found. Instead, there came to her lips the name Mary. The angel repeated it softly. Mary. It is a blessed name, he said. Blessed the roof that shelters a Mary in her need. There was a long silence in which Miss Terry felt new impulses stirring within her, impulses drawing her to the child whose looks recalled her own childhood. The angel regarded her with beaming eyes. After some time he said quietly, "Now let us see what became of your last experiment." Miss Terry started. It seemed as if she had been interrupted in pleasant dreaming. "You were the last experiment," she said. "I know what became of you. Here you are." "Yet more may have happened than you guessed," replied the angel meaningly. "I have tried to show you how often that is the case. Look again." Without moving from her chair, Miss Terry seemed to be looking out on her sidewalk, where, so it seemed, she had just laid the pink figure of the angel. She saw the drunken man approach. She heard his coarse laugh, saw his brutal movement as he kicked the Christmas token into the street. In sick disgust she saw him reel away out of sight. She saw herself run down the steps, rescue the image, and bring it into the house. Surely the story was finished. What more could there be? But something bade her vision follow the steps of the wretched man. Down the street he reeled, singing a blasphemous song. With a whoop he rounded a corner and ran into a happy party which filled sidewalk and street as it hurried in the direction from which he came. Good-naturedly they jostled him against the wall, and he grasped a railing to steady himself as they swept by. It was the choir on their way to carol in the next street. Before them went the cross-bearer, lifting high his simple wooden emblem. The eyes of the drunken man caught sight of this and wavered. The presence of the crowd conveyed no meaning to his dazed brains, but there was something in the familiar symbol which held his vision. He looked and crossed himself, remembering the traditions of his childhood. Some of the boys were humming as they went the stirring strains of an ancient Christmas march known to all nations, a carol which began, some say, as a rousing drinking chorus. The familiar strain touched some chord in the sodden brain. The man gave a feeble whinny, trying to follow the melody. He pulled himself together and lurched forward in a sudden impulse to join the band of pilgrims. But by the time he had taken 3 steps, they had vanished, miraculously, as it seemed to him. "Begorra, they're gone!" he cried. "Who were they? Were they rale folks? What was it they was singin'?" He sank back helplessly on a flight of steps. "Venite adoremus," he croaked in a quavering basso, and his tangled mind went through strange processes. Suddenly there came to him in a flash of exaggerated memory the figure of the Christmas angel, which not 10 minutes earlier he had kicked into the street. A pious horror fell upon him. "Mother o' mercy!" he cried, again crossing himself. "What have I been and done? It was a holy image, and what did I do to it? Let me go back and find it, and take it up out of the street." Greatly sobered by his fear, he staggered down the block and around the corner to the steps of Miss Terry's house. "This is the place," he mused. "I know it. Here's where the frindly lamp-post held me in its arms. I remember there was a dark house forninst me. Here's where it lay on the sidewalk all pink and pretty, and I kicked it into the street. Where is it now? Where gone? Holy Mother, here's the spot where it fell, look now, the shape of its little body and the wings of it in the snow. But 'tis gone entirely." He rubbed his eyes and crossed himself again. "'Tis flown away," he muttered. "'Tis gone back to Heaven to tell Mary Mother o' the wicked thing I done this night. Oh, 'tis a miracle that's happened. And oh, the wicked man I am, drunk and disorderly on the Holy Eve." O come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. Once more he heard the familiar strain taken up lustily by many voices. "Hear all the world singin' on the way to Bethlehem," he said, and the stupor seemed to leave his brain. He no longer staggered. "I'll run and join 'em, and I won't drink another drop this night." He looked up at the starry sky. "Maybe the Angel hears me. Maybe he'll help me to keep straight tomorrow. It might be my guardian angel himself that I treated so. Saints forgive me." With head bowed humbly, but no longer reeling, he moved away towards the sound of music. "You were his guardian angel," said Miss Terry, when once more she saw the figure on the mantel-shelf, and she spoke with reverent gentleness. The Angel smiled brightly. "The Christmas spirit is a guardian angel to many," he said. "Never again despise me, Angelina. Never again make light of my influence." "Never again," murmured Miss Terry half unconsciously. "I wish it were not too late." "It is never too late," said the Christmas Angel eagerly, as if he read her unspoken thought. "Oh, never too late, Angelina." Chapter 13. The Christmas Candle. Suddenly there was a sound, a dull, reverberating sound. It seemed to Miss Terry to come from neither north, south, east, nor west, but from a different world. Ah! She recognized it now. It was somebody knocking on the library door. Miss Terry gave a long sigh and drew herself up in her chair. "It must be Norah just come back," she said to herself. "I had forgotten Norah completely. It must be shockingly late. Come in!" she called, as she glanced at the clock. She rubbed her eyes and looked again. A few minutes after 9! She had thought it must be midnight. Norah entered to find her mistress staring at the mantel where the clock stood. She saw lying beside the clock the pink angel which had fallen from the box as she brought it in, the box now empty by the fire. "Law, miss," she said, "have you burned them all up but him? I'm glad you saved him. He's so pretty." "Norah," said Miss Terry with an effort, "is that clock right?" "Yes'm," said Norah. "I set it this morning. I came back as soon as I could, miss," she added apologetically. "It isn't that," answered Miss Terry, drawing her hand across her forehead dazedly. "I did not mind your absence, but I thought it must be later." "Oh, no, I wouldn't stay out any later when you was alone here, miss," said Norah penitently. "I felt ashamed after I had gone. I ought not to have left you so on Christmas Eve. But, oh, miss, the singing was so beautiful, and the houses looked so grand with the candles in the windows. It is like a holy night indeed." Miss Terry stooped and picked up something from the floor. It was the bit of candle end which had escaped the Holocaust. "Are the candles still lighted, Norah?" she asked, eyeing the bit of wax in her hand. "Yes'm, some of them," answered the maid. "It is getting late, and a good many have burned out, but some houses are still as bright as ever." "Perhaps it is not too late, then," murmured Miss Terry, as if yielding a disputed point. "Let us hurry, Norah." She rose and going to the mantel shelf gently took up the figure of the Angel, while Nora looked on in amazement. "Nora," said Miss Terry, with an eagerness which made her voice tremble, "I want you to hang the Christmas Angel in the window there. I, too, have a fancy to burn a candle to-night. If it is not too late, I'd like to have a little share in the Christmas spirit." Nora's eyes lighted. "Oh, yes'm," she said. "I'll hang it right away, and I'll find an empty spool to hold the candle." She bustled briskly about, and presently in the window appeared a little device unlike any other in the block. Against the darkness within, the figure of the Angel, with arms outstretched towards the street, shone in a soft light from the flame of a single tiny candle, such as blossom on Christmas trees. It caught the attention of many home-goers, who said, smiling, "How simple! How pretty! How quaint! It is a type of the Christmas spirit which is abroad to-night. You can feel it everywhere, blessing the city." For some minutes before the candle was lighted, a man muffled in a heavy overcoat had been standing in a doorway opposite Miss Terry's house. He was tall and grizzled, and his face was sad. He stared up at the gloomy windows, the only oblongs of blackness in the illuminated block, and he shivered, shrugging his shoulders. "The same as ever," he said to himself. "I might have known she would never change. Anyone else on Christmas Eve, after the letter I wrote her, would have softened a little. But I might have known. She is hard as nails. Of course it was my fault in the first place to leave her as I did. But when I acknowledged it, and when I wrote that letter on Christmas Eve, I thought Angelina might feel differently." He looked at his watch. "Nearly 9:30, he muttered. "I may as well go home. She said she wanted to be let alone, that Christmas meant nothing to her. I don't dare to call on my only sister. I suppose she is there all alone, and here I am all alone too. What a pity! If I saw the least sign—" Just then there was the spark of a match against the darkness framed in by the window opposite. A hand and arm shone in the flicker of light across the upper sash. A tiny spark, tremulous at first, like a bird alighting on a frail branch, paused, steadied, and became fixed. In the light of a small taper the man caught a glimpse of a pale, long face in a frame of silver hair. It faded into the background. But above the candle he now saw, with arms outstretched, as it seemed toward himself, a pink little angel with gauzy wings. The man's heart gave a leap. Sudden memories thronged his brain, making him almost dizzy. At last they formulated into one smothered cry. "The Christmas Angel! It is the very same pink angel that Angelina and I used to hang on our Christmas tree!" In 3 great leaps, like a schoolboy, he crossed the street and ran up the steps of number 87. The Christmas Angel seemed to smile with ineffable sweetness as he gave the bell a vigorous pull. Chapter 14. Tom. Miss Terry was leaning on the mantel-shelf looking into the fire, when the bell pealed furiously. She started and turned pale. "Lord a mercy!" ejaculated Nora, who was still admiring the effect of the window decoration. "What's that? Who can be calling here to-night making such a noise?" "Go to the door, Nora," said Miss Terry with a strange note in her voice. "It may be someone to see me. It is not too late." "Yes'm," said Nora, obedient but bewildered. Presently the library door opened and a figure strode in, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a fur overcoat. For a moment he stood just inside the door, hesitating. Miss Terry took 2 steps forward from the fireplace. "Tom," she said faintly, "you came, after all." "After all, Angelina," he said. "Yes, because I saw that." He waved his hand toward the window. "That gave me courage to come in. It is our Christmas angel. I remember all about it. Does it mean anything, Angelina?" Miss Terry held out a moment longer. Then she faltered forward. "Oh, Tom!" she sobbed, as she felt his brotherly strong arms about her. "Oh, Tom! And so he has brought you back to me, and me to you." "He? Angelina girl, who?" He smoothed her silver hair with rough, kind fingers. "Why, the Christmas angel. Our guardian angel, Tom. All these years I kept him in the play box, and I was going to burn him up. But I couldn't do it, Tom. How wonderful it is!" They sat down before the fire, and she began to tell him the whole story. But she interrupted herself to send for Nora, who came to her mystified and half scandalized by the greeting which she had seen those two oldsters exchange. "This is my brother Tom, Nora, who has come back," she said. "I believe it is not too late to make some preparation for Christmas Day. The stores will still be open. Run out and order things for a grand occasion, Nora. And, oh, Nora!" A sudden remembrance came to her. "If you have time, will you please get some toys and pretty things such as a little girl would like? A little girl of about 10, with my complexion. I mean, with yellow hair and blue eyes. We may have a little guest to-morrow." "Yes'm," said Nora, moving like one in a dream. "A guest?" exclaimed Tom, and Miss Terry told him about Mary. "I love little girls," said Tom, "especially little girls with yellow hair and blue eyes, such as you used to have, Angelina." "You will like Mary, then," said Miss Terry, with a pretty pink flush of pleasure in her cheeks. "I shall like her, if she comes," amended Tom, who, manlike, received with reservations the account of a vision vouchsafed not unto him. "She will come," said Miss Terry with her old positiveness, glancing towards the window where the Christmas angel hung. Then arose the sound of singing outside the house. The passing choristers had spied the quaint window, now the only one in the street which remained lighted. "When Christ was born of Mary free, in Bethlehem, in that fair city, angels sang with mirth and glee, in excelsis Gloria." Chapter 15. Christmas Day. And Mary came. The brother and sister were at breakfast, the happiest which either of them had known for years, when there came a timid pull at the front door bell. Miss Angelina laid down her knife and fork and looked across the table at Tom. "She has come. Mary has come," she said. "Nora, if it is a little girl with a package under her arm, bring her in here." "Yes'm," gasped Nora, who believed she was living in a dream where everything was topsy-turvy. When had a child entered Miss Terry's dining room? Nora disappeared and presently returned, ushering in a little girl of 10, with blue eyes and yellow hair. Under her arm she carried a white paper package, very badly wrapped. Miss Terry exchanged with her brother a glance which said, "I told you so." The child seemed bashful and afraid to speak. No wonder. Tom's kind heart yearned to her. "Good morning. Wish you a Merry Christmas, Mary," he said, smiling. The child gave a start. "Why, how did you know my name?" she cried. Tom looked confused. How indeed did he know? But Miss Angelina, with a readiness that surprised herself, came to his rescue. "We were talking of a little girl named Mary," she said. and you look just like her. What did you come for, dear?" The little girl hung her head and turned crimson. I came to see Angelina Terry," she whispered. I've got a doll that belongs to her." There was a pause. Then Miss Terry said, "Well, go on." I found her on the steps of this house last night, and I ought to have brought her right here then, but I didn't. I took her home. I hope Angelina was not very unhappy last night." Miss Terry smiled upon Tom, who gave a kind, low laugh. "No," said Miss Terry. "Angelina did not worry about her lost doll. She was thinking about something else, the nicest Christmas present that ever anybody had. But you were a good girl to bring back the doll." "No, I'm not a good girl," said Mary, and her voice trembled. "I was a wicked girl. I meant to keep Miranda for myself because I thought she would be a lovely big doll, and when I found she was old and homely, somehow I still wanted to keep her. But it was stealing, and I couldn't. Please, will you give her to Angelina and tell her I am so sorry?" She took Miranda out of the wrapping and held her toward Miss Terry without looking at the doll. It was as if she were afraid of being tempted once more. Miss Terry did not take the doll. "I am Angelina," she said. "The doll was mine." "You! Angelina!" The child's face was full of bewilderment. Mechanically she drew Miranda to her and clasped her close. "Yes, I am Angelina, and that was my doll Miranda," said Miss Terry gently. "Thank you for returning her. But Mary, your name is Mary." The child nodded. "Suppose I wanted you to keep her for me. What would you say?" Mary's eyes still dwelt upon Miss Terry with a puzzled look. This gray-haired Angelina was so different from the one she had pictured. She did not answer the question. Miss Terry drew the child to a chair beside her. "Tell me all about yourself, Mary," she said. After some coaxing and prompting from what they already guessed, Mary told the story of her sad little life. She was an orphan recently left to the care of her uncle and aunt, who had received her grudgingly. They were her sole relatives, and the shame of their degraded lives was plain through the outlines of the vague picture which Mary sketched of them. "You do not love them, Mary?" asked Miss Terry kindly. "No," answered the child. "They always speak crossly to me. When they have been drinking they beat me." Tom rose from the table with a muttered word and began to pace the floor. His blue eyes were full of tears. "Mary," said Miss Terry, "will the people at home be worried if you do not come back to dinner?" Mary shook her head wonderingly. "No," she said. "They will not care. I am often away on holidays. I go to the museums." "Then I want you to stay with us today," said Miss Terry. "We are going to have a Christmas celebration, and we need you for a guest. Will you stay, you and Miranda?" Mary looked down at the doll in her arms, and up at the two kind faces bent toward her. "Yes," she said impulsively, "I will stay. How good you are! I don't want to go home." "Don't go home," burst out Tom. "Stay with us always and be our little girl." Mary looked from one to the other, half frightened at the new idea. Miss Terry bent and pecked at her cheek, with a thrill at the new sensation. "Yes, we mean it," she said, and her voice was almost sweet. "We believe that the Christmas angel has brought you to us, Mary. You have the Christmas name. But you seem to us like the little girl we both knew best, little Angelina with blue eyes and yellow hair, who was Miranda's mother. Will you stay with us, Mary Angelina? Would you like to stay?" Mary looked up with a wistful smile. "You are so good," she said again. "I wish I could stay, but Uncle and Aunt are so. I am afraid of what they might do to us all. If they thought you wanted me, they would not let me go." "I will fix Uncle and Aunt," said Tom, going for his coat. "Leave them to me. I know an argument that settles uncles and aunts of that sort. You need not go back to their house, I promise you, Mary, my dear." Mary gave a great sigh of relief. "Oh, I am so glad," she said. "It was such a wicked house, and here it is so good." "Good!" Miss Terry echoed the word with a sigh. "Come with me, Mary," she said. She led her little guest through the hall to the library, where a great fire was blazing, with sundry mysterious packages in white paper piled on the table beside it. But Miss Terry did not stop at the fireplace. She drew Mary to the window which looked out on the sidewalk. Above the lower sash Mary saw the remains of a burned-out Christmas candle, and over it hung a pink papier-mâché angel, stretching out open arms towards her. "This is the Christmas angel, Mary," said Miss Terry. "He is as old as Miranda." "He is as old as Christmas," interrupted Tom, looking in from the hall. "When we were children, Tom and I, we hung him on our Christmas tree," went on Miss Terry. "We think he brought you to us. We believe he has changed the world for us, has brought us peace, goodwill, and happiness. He is going to be the guardian angel of our house. You must love him, Mary." "How beautiful he is," said Mary reverently. "His face shines like the baby's that I saw once in the church. Oh, Miss Angelina, he is like the Christ child himself." "Call me Aunt Angelina," said Miss Terry with a quick breath. "Aunt Angelina!" cried the child, throwing her arms about Miss Terry's neck. Tom came and put his great furry coat sleeves about them both. "And Uncle Tom," he said. "Dear Uncle Tom," whispered the child shyly. There were tears in the eyes of all three. "Now we shall live happy ever after," said Tom. And the Christmas angel beamed upon them.